back to Arah and the conclusion of Path 1 with this incredible lore bomb. This will be the last part of the dungeon series. We're currently playing on a warrior designed to spam out might, extra power, and banner buffs to our entire team as we go through Path 2, 3, and 4. This is the second video in Arah. If you're looking for a more detailed explanation about Lupe, how this is all structured, you should definitely see the prior episode. And while you're at it, go back through the whole series. So Path 1 took us through the generally southern reaches of the environment. For Path 2, we're going to go into a more central route and be looking at a race I hold far higher in esteem. Not the Jotun. We're looking this time at the Mursaat. Which of the contemporary races is interested in the Mursaat, you might wonder? Well, ArenaNet paired them with the Asura, and for reasons that the story of this path makes abundantly clear. I really like the idea that history is doomed to repeat itself, lest we preserve it correctly, and that we can genuinely draw parallels between the contemporary 5 races and the old races, seeing us fall into the same pitfalls and traps. That's exactly what Path 2 of Arah is setting out to say.
Truth and knowledge are 2 different things.
Scholar Lissa, you'll notice, even seems to be coloured in general Mursaat-themed armorware, something one of you guys in the party pointed out, and I think is a pretty cool observation. She says, I study the Mursaat, and I have a theory about the origin of their powers. What can you tell me about the Mursaat, we say? She says the Mursaat, also called the Unseen Ones, were a race of powerful spellcasters. They've not been seen for centuries, and I think they're now extinct. What can you tell me about Mursaat magic, we ask? She says, I believe they use their spellcasting to slip beneath the skin of the world out of phase with Tyria. Well, this is going to be an interesting one, because the Mursaat did get something of a storyline if you pick the right choices as a human, but it's more focused around the White Mantle, who followed the Mursaat, than the Mursaat themselves. You'll remember from that storyline that they were playing with the idea, are the Mursaat extinct or not? And this story step will continue to ask that question. She says, I already have agents combing the ruins here for ancient Mursaat artifacts, and that reference to allies of hers will become important in just a second. Not that we'll find very many of them. Lastly, we can ask if the artifacts are necessary to learn about them, and she says no, but the inscriptions will show us how the Mursaat shifted out of phase, and perhaps allow us to do it as well. Obviously, what Lissa is talking about here is the fact that the Mursaat, as was demonstrated in Guild Wars 1, could go completely invisible, walking amongst and manipulating mankind at their will without people being any the wiser. It was only by ascending and gaining the gift of true sight we were able to bypass this magic in the first game and see them whenever we chose. Despite all this story, the idea of it being simply out of phase is new with Scholar Lissa here.
Excellent. Someone else as interested in the Mursaat as I. The Mursaat are a lost race, but once they ruled humans as the Unseen Ones. What legends I have uncovered say they use powerful magic to shift themselves out of phase with this world. I believe they use this as a way to escape the Elder Dragons. Come, the secret of the Mursaat must be somewhere in these ruins.
I absolutely adore her description of it as slipping beneath the skin of Tyria. It's really poetically worded, but does leave a little room for interpretation. Does this mean that the Mursaat are visiting the mists, as other areas of the lore have led us to believe? Or is it some other form of magic that's not quite the same as going to the mists? I guess that depends on which in-game scholar you prefer to listen to most. Another brilliant thing you'll see the devs have done here is taken an original Guild Wars prophecy story, the Mursaat who could go invisible as an ancient race, and combined it with the newer Guild Wars 2 concept of Elder Dragons. When prophecies and the Mursaat were written, way back in 2006 and before, there was no idea of the Elder Dragons. What the writing team have done here is intelligently pair 2 different pieces of lore in a way that makes a lot of sense. Scholar Lissa's theory that the Mursaat used this magic to hide from the dragons and that's how they survived, well, that's totally plausible. On our way along with the path, you'll notice this time we've moved towards the staircase in the center and then headed left. And even the area with the wreck of the Rhiannon's Dream is still available, even if there's nothing to fight or any content to play. I like that the devs allowed us to walk into that place instead of just putting a closed door we couldn't get past. Here another rare risen awaits us. This is a Defiler. You'll see his flavor text says he has a poisonous aura, with the corresponding active effect called Noxious Aura. Just by standing by him, I take a lot of damage over time. This is a really simple concept that can encourage players to use their range set instead of meleeing, but the Noxious Aura hardly appears anywhere, barely here in Explorable, and certainly not in the personal story or open world content. A funny, positive side effect of that mechanic was that it would affect stealth players, who had grown very accustomed to be totally ignoring everything the dungeon had. But if you're stealthed and you walk near one of those Defilers, you'd still be poisoned and thrown in combat, slowed down, all the same. I like it for that. More rare enemies here, including more Berserkers we saw very briefly in Path 1. You'll see he's stacking Fury on himself, and he's got over 20 stacks of it. As he strikes, he gains more. That's utterly contrary to the type of Fury we as players get, which only stacks duration and not intensity. Honestly, I really like the idea of Fury as an intensity stacking boon, same as regeneration. And maybe these weird Risen are an example of the fact that devs did play with that at some point pre-release, but never has there been an interview talking about it. This isn't the only time we're going to see boons being used in a really weird way in Arah. There'll be something with swiftness later. Oh, and I'll note that these are actually buffs appearing not on the regular boon bar, but on the buff bar, which is the lower row of active effects. That's another sign it's a super old mechanic, because it used to be that all boons appeared down there, and you can still see even several personal story bosses exhibiting the same thing. One of the defining aspects of Path 2 Arah revolves around one of the enemy types that is very common: dominated Deadeyes. There are a variety of undead using rifles that will snipe you. The snipe animation is really obvious. When they take their target, an electrical beam will connect them to their foe. You'll see that this one's trying to snipe this bear here. And then, after a few seconds, boom, they'll one-shot you. This is a unique skill in that you can't use most defensive. It will go through blocking abilities like Aegis and Riposte, and importantly, even reflect walls and deflect things, like this feedback my Mesmer just tried to cast and did nothing. The whole idea is to play around Guild Wars 2's big new shiny mechanic, dodging. It's dodging that will save you here, and getting the timing right is super satisfying. Aside from how it's sort of wonky for player expectation management, you're not sure what skills should go through what defenses, it's amazing to me that the devs demonstrated here, before the game came out, that it would be necessary to have some projectiles going through reflect walls, that it was a worthwhile thing to implement for the game. But they only chose to use it here at these Deadeyes, when there are about 100 other really important mechanics throughout the roster of all the dungeons that could have had the same treatment. Just look at how often I've said in the commentary for these videos, oh, this would be a problem, but we reflect it. Turns out, it's only very rarely, like here in Arah, the devs tried to do something about it. Oh, and you might have noticed something too. We're not getting one shot. I don't know when this changed, but it must be that sometime recently, there was a patch stopping these guys being so deadly. Now their damage is pretty much negligible, and it's just a bit of knockback instead. I can absolutely understand the desire to nerf these guys. They were much more deadly than most of the other standard fare Risen you find around here. Maybe they identify with the players who couldn't learn the dodge timing and felt the frustration of wiping over and over against these Deadeyes. Fine. But what's particularly irksome about this nerf is some Deadeyes are nerfed to now just be minor damage and a bit of knockback, while others still have the full-on one-shot snipe potential. So why some and not the others? Worse, there's absolutely no way to tell which variety of Deadeye it is. The new nerfed ones or the old unnerfed ones. Their names are the same, their health is the same, the animation for the snipe skill is all exactly the same. You'll see that at play in just a moment. But now, if this was in service of helping out new players, I can't get behind it. It feels like a mess. No one knows what to expect anymore. I really doubt it was intended either. It's probably a result of some spaghetti code, where the developer who implemented this nerf thought that they'd nerfed all of them, but in fact, for some reason, there are multiple varieties, and they only ended up getting some. I know I'm going on about it a bit much, but I feel really strongly that this was a terrible change.
So, you're finally catching up with us, eh?
That is Surah. I recognize her. She's Inquest. She was talking to my scouts earlier. I knew they were interested in the Mursaat.
Your scouts are dead, Scholar. And soon you will be as well. Time to launch an ambush!
So if you were wondering why the undead here were called dominated, I think the idea is that it's the Inquest that have dominated them, and somehow they're under their control or thraldom. Maybe. The story doesn't really touch on that much. But yeah, we're not actually going to find any other agents out on the field of Scholar Yssa's. They're all dead, and instead, we'll be dealing with the Inquest the whole way through. I want to point out one thing that's interesting immediately about that. It was only in the last dungeon that there still was dialogue suggesting we had routed the Inquest threat, and they were pretty much done for. But then, here in Arah Explorable, they're back, in full force, and that's not going to change at any point in any other story later in the game. This boss is pretty easy. Her dialogue suggests she'll get reinforcements, but she doesn't. The barrels are here to lock you in the arena, she occasionally teleports around, and has an AoE one-shot mechanic you probably want to reflect. Sort of like a super Deadeye. A really interesting thing about that skill is if she targets you with it and fires it, but you're not in combat, then you were to say waypoint to the other side of the map, the start of the dungeon say, her projectile will follow you hundreds of miles across all the terrain and still nail you dead when she has absolutely no line of sight whatsoever. Pretty fun, and something anyone who would solo and duo this a lot had a lot of experience dealing with. She's one of those rooted enemies, by the way, with that permanent immobilize on her bar that doesn't actually affect her break bar, and her general attacks actually apply reasonable condition damage pressure if I remember rightly. But with a 5-man group, we can clean her out quite quickly. Way later in today's video, you're going to look back at this area from a totally different part of the dungeon and be amazed how close some things are. But until then, let's move forwards and check out the next encounter.
History never lies. Historians, however...
Which I haven't done, so to speak, properly for many years. The idea is an awful lot like in the Crucible of Eternity story mode, where we have to follow Mr. Sparkles, keeping him charged up as he keeps us safe from the toxic, radioactive, deep areas of the lab. Same thing here, except instead of Mr. Sparkles, it's one member of the team who can climb into this power suit and actually gets to control exactly where we walk. That's me for this run. You'll see I only have 2 skills. One, that looks like the engineer's rocket boots, is for me to actually leave the power suit. And skill 1 creates this blue dome. The dome is insane knockback and blowout for any Risen that try to aggress us, as long as my allies keep firing a recharging gun at me. I'll have the energy to use this skill. Nowadays, you'd find ArenaNet would tie a mechanic like this to ammunition, but since they didn't have that available in 2012, my skill simply locks out every now and then. If you pay close attention to my active effects bar, you'll see there is an icon there that demonstrates just how much power I have to continue spamming this blue orb and keeping us safe. There are enormous numbers of Risen in here. Without the protection of the golem, or stealth, you'll get ripped to pieces very easily. The only things that can break through the golem's defense are abominations, which are immune to the CC. And you'll notice it's not necessarily the A-bombs themselves that do a ton of damage. It's instead that they can knock me around, and thus everyone ends up outside of the blue bubble, and then we have a problem on our hands. Thankfully, our thief is able to stealth us, so we do a bit of a hybrid mechanic here, where we're trying to shake aggro with a bit of stealth, and we're also using the proper golem technique. If any one of our players, though, ends up getting revealed, the enemies will still know where we are and charge us, which is what's happened here. We tried to sneak out of a side exit, something most dungeon runners would use when going through that sequence solo, charging through with stealth and then getting out as early as possible. And normally in this small cave, you would break aggro, but because we've been doing the encounter properly, it seems that the spiders still want to fight, and we have a huge number of them to kill. Now I know they all look like elites, but they're actually still reasonably squishy, even if they still do a ton of damage, and the result is a pretty intense battle. What you're watching right now is some of the most fun I had in Arah over the whole night on all the paths. Look at how precarious and dangerous this is. I do think the Guild Wars 2 developers were right when they said some of the most fun that can be had in endgame content is where things go wrong. This is the equivalent of your tank dying, but in Guild Wars 2. We just need to make sure we can hold out, get everything cleaved down, and keep everyone alive. And with that, the sequence is beaten. You'll notice at the far side of the long walk we were taking the golem is a small Asuran turret that the Risen are perpetually attacking. I think the idea is that that turret's supposed to take aggro away from us if we get out of the exit instead of climbing over the wall, and with that, we can continue to progress deeper into Arah. We're actually walking slowly right now, back towards the Giganticus Lupicus encounter. But first, we need to meet up with some of the areas you found in Path 1 and the detonator. Some more enemies here to talk about. Again, kind of rare. You'll notice my screen is shaking a ton. That's from these dominated sentinels. They're guardians that drop rings of warding that can lock you in place, especially dangerous when you need a little bit of room to dodge the Deadeyes. If you're about to be sniped and you try to dodge away only to hit the ring, your dodge roll will be interrupted and you'll get one shot. A really nasty combo that I think was very clever for the devs to put together. The screen shake is because as you attack sentinels, they're supposed to be blocking or using some degree of defensive magic, and the screen shake is to show just how dangerous that is. But with the rate of animation strikes in the game, it just means your screen will go absolutely crazy. There are lots of little cubby holes and side caves you can walk through to try and minimize the amount of aggro you grab in these caves. I actually like this format a lot. It's like the devs are acknowledging, hey, we know that you're gonna want to skip, so let's make a game out of it. Here's some places you can try to walk to avoid aggro and be sneaky, or here's some more direct routes. It's up to you. Often over the years, I felt like the devs didn't like the idea of people skipping at all, but in environments like this, they're practically begging you to. They're adding the caves to walk through. More on that later in the path. This last group, you'll see, finally, has more Deadeyes, and these are the ones that can once again one-shot us. Like I said, they don't look or see or feel any different, but looking down at the combat log, you'll see their kill shot now is nailing me for about 19,000 damage. With these random enemies defeated, we can jump over this cliff, and you'll see we're connecting back up to Path 1 now, where we also jumped off of a cliff after the crystalline entities. This is the detonator. Everything along this part of the dungeon is exactly the same. You can choose to fight the same spiders that emulate Malrona in Path 3, the same optional Drake, but when we get to where before we thought Shogroth, there'll be a different boss to fight instead. This is the one where killing that bonus Drake can genuinely be important, because it's closer to the Drake than the Shogroth encounter. You'll see, it's an Abomination. Like I said, Abominations are cool, and this is Arah Explorables, the endgame's best version of an Abomination battle. There's not too much going on here, especially compared to Shogroth, but let's talk about it. Number one are a selection of Inquest handlers that seem to have the A-bomb subdued. You'll notice when I go near them, the A-bomb threw a rock at me, which did insane damage, and that's one of his mechanics. He hits hard if you let him nail you with boulders from far away. But also, the Inquest in the area do a lot of damage with their tranquilizer guns. Killing the Inquest lets you pick up their guns, and that's what I'm holding now. I have one skill called a tranquilizer dart. That's important for the main man, this Berserker Abomination that's a legendary. Quite quickly, he'll try to go berserk, and while berserk, he does insane damage. He was actually in the middle of the animation there as I spoke, but we broke his break bar at the perfect time, thus interrupting it. Under normal circumstances, I'd be really happy about that, but since I'm trying to show you the mechanics, we have to wait a bit longer now for him to try and use it again. So here we go. You can see he's powering up, and once he's successfully done so, he gets the berserk effect on him. He starts glowing red, and during this state, he's ultra threatening. Fortunately, our clones and minions have him distracted for now, but just wait till you see one of his regular skills, an AoE blowout, and what happens. Yeah, he just scored a quadra kill. The only member of our team to survive was the Mesmer, who was staying way, way, way back. Once the Abominations utilized that animation, he's gone back to normal. But, especially at 2012, where this fight would take a very long time, you really needed a better way of dealing with that. He berserks fairly regularly. I bring you back to the tranquilizer guns. We kill some Inquests who were perpetually respawning, not just in the interests of keeping ourselves alive, but so that we can pick up their tranquilizers. Now, when we next see the Abomination goes berserk, as he currently is in the animation, when I use my tranq gun, a small projectile, it will de-berserk him and allow us to go and attack. That's the main thing with this fight. Also, he's got the blowout that's fairly easy to dodge. You just saw me accomplish it there. As an Abomination, He is the same as any others in terms of his attack speed, so you can actually just run in little circles around him and he'll never really be able to hit you. It's a technique I demonstrated many times while soloing story dungeons, and you can utilize here as well. I know he's big and scary and intimidating and has truly extreme damage, but because he always moves quite slow and lumbering, it is not that crazy to suggest a lot of players can kill this abomination without taking a single hit of damage, really. With all the mechanics demonstrated, we've all now moved in and we're going to do some extra damage. For a normal group, I'd suggest just bringing a little bit of stability, something else Guardians really excel at, and down he goes.
There were Mursaat artifacts here, but they have been plundered. They are ahead of us. I fear these ancient writings will reveal the secrets of the Mursaat.
That's a pretty pointless cutscene, really. We already knew from the start of the dungeon that we were looking for Inquest writings. We didn't learn much more there, right? I guess if the devs had more time and dialogue they could have implemented, instead we might have heard the Inquest talking about those writings. Instead, we just get a couple of random lines from Scholar Lissa and are told to go further in. Killing the Abomination is a rare moment where it unlocks a waypoint a bit further forward, where we would kill Shogroth if we were in Path 1. So you can use that, as you just saw I did, by double-click on the minimap to jump forwards and not have to run the whole length of the way up there. Now, we're on the exact same course as Path 1, heading into Lupe's room. So I'll show you this time a safer route on the left. But while you watch that, there's probably another thing you've desperately been thinking and wanted me to mention about Path 2, and that's the fact that several varieties of undead in this actually, eventually, became playable elite specializations. I won't spoil exactly which those were, but we've already seen at least 2. You might be looking for more meaning in that, or some commentary from me that sheds further light on the situation, but I honestly don't have anything. I think, honestly, it's probably a coincidence. Though, if I were reading it now, spotting that accidental trend, I'd probably have fun to keep going with it and make even more elite specializations in the future, named after some of the Risen we've been fighting here.
That's the corpse of a Giganticus lupicus! Their extinction matches the possible last time the Elder Dragons awoke. Hold on now, I think it's stirring.
Yisha's dialogue there blatantly points out something that was meant to be a revelation to the Norn scholar in the prior path, that the Giganticus lupicus were extinct around the same time the Elder Dragons last awoke. I find that kind of funny, like the Asura are one step ahead of the curve at all times. On some of these paths, you can actually go back to your NPC and ask them about what we just fought, but Yisha has no such dialogue for us. Instead, let's move on through one of these newly opened doorways for another long running section filled with dead eyes and assorted undead. I find myself continually standing there and checking now to see whether the dead eyes we're facing are the new or the old variety. It does seem that in general, as the path goes along, the more deadly dead eyes come along, so perhaps this is all some grand design, and it's the devs attempting to make Path 2 feel more dangerous as we go deeper in it. Something that's not exactly happening in any of the other dungeons across the game, but I think makes some sense. At the Ghost Lamp Way area, what a beautiful place name for what it's worth, you'll end up going underwater. There isn't much underwater combat in Arah, but there are a few sequences. Here we have a minefield, and dotted around the minefield are these swirls. Move into them for a new type of swiftness that stacks on top of regular swiftness and, you guessed it, just like the Fury before, stacks intensity instead of duration. Again, the idea of a swiftness boon that gets stronger the more times you apply it, up to 25 or with diminishing returns, however the devs might like to do it, sounds super fun to me, but it's only here in Arah you'll get to experience it. The other side of these long watery tunnels that are deceptively free roaming, by the way, there's not that many routes out of them, you'll come up to the Rotting Armada. It's a bit of a maze, but these torches are guiding your way, as is often the case in Guild Wars 2, follow the light. Back outside, the Rotting Armada is a really cool location. Vast, open plains where, right at the start, you can immediately see our next boss, but to get to them is going to take a lot of walking. Even while trying to kill all enemies and absorb all the detail, these are still long, empty corridors with not much to see or do. The idea of the place, I think, is brilliant. That this is where the Orions had their armada, their navies docked, and the entire thing ended up getting flooded. You'll notice this is a minefield. Just like in SE, there are a lot more of them. Along the main path are a couple of Inquest turrets designed to immobilize you and get you caught into the explosions. But blatantly accessible to the side of the field is this route that gives you the higher ground and allows you to bypass, quite literally, everything about this sequence. It's not a case of, do you want to deal with the mines or do you want to deal with some Risen? It's just, do you want to deal with the mines or simply walk? I guess this is only visible for players who notice this slightly more concealed entrance at the start. Is this our reward, that we get through the dungeon quicker for having noticed a doorway when other people might not have? But in any case, it's up this ramp that most people will always use while going through this dungeon. There's just no point to go into the minefield. I have to assume there's some cut content on this. Look at these small cages with torches, just here for no reason and not used. Maybe we had to free people from them at some point, but all of that content ends up missing. Perhaps in the name of keeping the paths a roughly equal length. Go through, and you'll come to these next enemies, where we'll be facing off against Inquest again. Much like the Deadeyes earlier, these guys have electric beams, but these aren't one-shotting, they're subverting us, keeping us permanently stunned. We have seen this before, very briefly, in the Crucible of Eternity story mode. If you're the only player, these can be brutally difficult, ripping through your stability very fast and then locking you in place, especially with 2 subversion rifles on you at once. However, with a team of 5, someone else can always land a stun or something on the guy shooting you with the rifle and free you. Not to mention the fact that those Inquest do nothing but hold someone stunned. So as long as they're outnumbered, you'll always win the fight, just because you can damage them where they can't really do much else. It is a cool combo seeing the subversion rifle guys in the minefields with Deadeyes around at the same time. I really think that the developers designing this path had a lot of fun figuring out different ways you can combo separate mechanics to get players killed. It's a bit like what we saw earlier with the Sentinels. With that vast quantity of territory traversed, we're now ready for the next boss. I'm lingering here just for a second to point out that unlike many bosses in dungeons, for this one, once you actually aggro them, a giant wall will appear behind you, locking you into the fighting area. The idea of locking players into the boss area is something more contemporary content always does. But at launch, it was only a couple of places and a couple of paths we actually saw that being utilized. This being one of the very few. The area we're fighting is at the point of interest Demon's Shoal, and I actually adore this fight. You remember in Sorrow's Embrace, I talked a bit about destructible terrain and it not being used much. Well, here's an example of a boss fight doing just that. Our opponent isn't an Inquest or anything. They just seem to be a risen pirate Mesmer? No particular story to them, and certainly not related to the Mursaat, but it's a cool mix of themes they're going with. I can't help but feel the name of the boss, Alphard, Serpent of the Waves, means that preliminary designs had this as a crate. Undead endgame explorable dungeon crate would go perfectly here. We're in a Rotting Armada after all. But he's not a crate. In fact, the crate in general are mysteriously missing from all endgame content at launch. Not a single dungeon includes them. And for the life of me, I can't figure out why. ArenaNet went to the effort of making such a well fleshed out evil faction for us to fight, populated them all over the personal story in the open world, but didn't think to use this deliciously evil faction for the end game content where we face the most dangerous of horrors? Really now? My grand theory is that originally this entire path was going to be about the crate looking for Mursaat artifacts, not the Inquest. The Inquest was supposed to have been dealt with in COE after all. Maybe the pairing of Crate and Mursaat would have been interesting in that the Crate are supposed to be total black and white evil, as described by the developers in the pre-release behind-the-scenes blog post about the creation of their race, while the Mursaat, also extremely evil, had those extra shades of grey and layers to them. This path would have seen the Crate following in the footsteps of the Mursaat, for better or worse. That's why the environments are centered around a Rotting Armada. That's why this path is one of the few to feature underwater content areas. we could have been fighting Crate down there in the original design docs. That's why earlier in the path, we saw lots of little unused cages. Crate are always being depicted with their slaves and their cages, with us, the hero, having the opportunity to break people free. Probably that missing dynamic event back there had something to do with that. It's also why, after we fight this boss, you'll see we go to a lot of areas that feel a lot like Crate Deeps with their gangways. There are just too many signs here for them. The story could have been that while all was underwater, some Crate came to live here, fleeing from the deep sea dragon, and started looking into Mursaat artifacts. They've clung to them for years, and now we needed to stop them. But all of that got removed. Why? I don't know. And why replace it with the Inquest too? I couldn't tell you that either. Just one more mystery to ponder, and the result is there's really not much Crate interaction with any of the dungeons. The mechanics here are layered. First of all, Alphard will occasionally drop big bombs like an engineer that if you don't step away from, will one-shot you. They're easy to see, they're marked with a red ring AoE telegraph. Aside from this, 99% of what they'll do is projectile-based. And there were methods of completely AFK killing this boss as a mesmer using illusory wardens in the past. That's not possible anymore, but it's a good illustration of just how projectile loaded this pistol wielding boss is. Every now and then, Alphard will do something mesmery. They'll teleport away from you into the center of these active camo boxes mysteriously set up. They don't look very Inquesty, do they? They're never explained. And summon a ton of clones. The clones can do good damage and will also stay at range using projectiles, so it's a good idea to pick a decent line of sight spot. Our team isn't necessarily doing that. While in the center, Alphard will use the Thieves' skill Dagger Storm. It does massive damage, and the idea is that you should hide behind these camouflage boxes to obstruct all of those projectiles. Once Alphard's done Dagger Storming, they'll actually destroy some of these crates. And if you take too long to kill the boss, eventually all the crates will be broken, you'll be out of cover, and then likely die. Well, that's what the devs were designing this to be like. You can instead just hide in any number of other places, and even in the olden days, this boss would not take as long as the devs anticipated, so the destructible terrain component has never really factored in. Either you or the boss will be finished way before that time happens. Even still, I think it's brilliant that they were looking into this as a mechanic, and whoever was making this dungeon path was definitely more creative than most.
They have plundered this site as well. If the Inquest discover the secrets of the Mursaat, they could become unstoppable.
With Alphard, the risen, undead, mesmer, engineer, thief, pirate, crate defeated, we can move through the last running section of the dungeon to get to the final boss. You'll notice, despite how cool the Mursaat are, there's basically no real Mursaat dialogue in this dungeon until the very end. It's great looking back at the city over there, seeing the arches from far away. We can move into this doorway, which previously had been barricaded with a big, Asuri looking barrier. Rewind the video if you missed it. It's a nice effect. What we're going to be facing here are plague carrier abominations. They, on a long delay, will eventually explode, doing lots of damage and conditions. As you can see, hopefully, most of these effects I am trying to eat so you guys can get a gist for how much damage this stuff would do. They also spawn grubs, and this again is something you did get a little taste of in the previous dungeon, the Crucible of Eternity. You can guess what the idea is going to be. That's right, Inquest technicians that hold you stunned, while now it's these guys that run over and blow up next to you. One mechanic to hold you down, the other to do the damage. This is actually, even though it's at the end of the path, the more forgiving of the other variations we've seen throughout, and I think ArenaNet probably should have reversed the ordering. We have basically a lot of this same setup to get through in this next large open area, but I do want to point out how beautiful the skybox is out in the background. Feels a lot like Guild Wars 1 skybox is there, and in the center of the room, if you walk close to this giant ship, you'll realize it's a massive Orion Imperial barge. You can look right up it, but not actually explore. It's one of the largest ships you can find in the whole game, just docked here, like so many other epic ships we've glimpsed as the adventure's gone along. The final roadways of Path 2 are somewhat a tour revisiting the various types of enemies we've seen throughout. There are sentinels here, berserkers, defilers, more technicians, more deadeyes, trying to block your progress. This bit was actually kind of tough to get through even with stealth. Often I would find myself having exhausted my endurance on one wave of enemies, only to then be one-shot by some other ones slightly towards the exit. If you were caught for even a second while trying to skip these outside of stealth, you'd get stun-locked and be done for. The last room here, Inquest base Brawn Zelith, doesn't actually look like an Inquest base whatsoever. I have a feeling that place name was probably shifted from being something that referred to the crate to instead referring to the Inquest without any actual environment work being done. That's why it's basically like a Deeps, even though it's not. The idea here, I think, is that if you just try to walk to your ultimate objective on the far side of the room, you'll be confronted with a cliff that means you have to turn around and go all the way along the gangplanks we've already cleared out. But strangely, the devs never tried very hard with this cliff. You can jump up it in not just one place, but 3 or 4. It's so easy to climb this cliff, you'd probably do it without realizing that you're sequence breaking or, dare we go extreme enough to say, exploiting at all. Maybe the devs just didn't care at this point, and it means the whole gangway section is something most players never look at. And now, finally, we're at the end of the path, with a cutscene.
Stop right there. You've stolen enough Mursaat relics.
We've only just begun. With this knowledge, we can become like the Mursaat themselves. We will leave this world to the dragons and then return and rule once they sleep again.
Not on my watch. Your madness ends here.
I do genuinely see the Inquest perspective on this one. I don't think it's that crazy to want to hide from the dragons and just return later. There's nothing suggesting we can't get everyone away safely, but the story doesn't allow room for that discussion. The Inquest are the bad guys for being cowards. You need to fight. This is Guild Wars 2. It's about battles and loot. So, let's see how we deal with Operative Bree. Well, she's invulnerable, hidden behind this barrier, and even if we try to use projectiles, you see, we can't actually do any damage.
Some assistance would be appreciated.
As soon as you aggro on her, she'll call for help from these undead. I guess the idea is that, like with the dominated ones before, the Inquest have some vague control over them. Why they're not Inquest allies helping out, I don't know. Possibly just because this is supposed to be Arah. We already had a dungeon to do with Inquest. In theory, that dungeon actually had more to do with other dragons. Instead, we need to come with one player over to this terminal. Activating us slips us out of phase with reality. We get this fantastic ghostly translucent effect, and now can walk over to the Mursaat testbed Zelith. Here, we can actually fight Bree, but it's important to note I'm the only player in the party that's allowed to do that right now. Everyone else needs to defend the terminal from breaking from all the onslaught waves of undead that are constantly charging. I only get to be out of phase for a little while, before then I'm forced back and can't do any damage to the main boss. And if I go back to the panel, it says I'm already in a quasi-spectral state and I can't re-enter for a while. Now I need to trade off for another player who can enter the terminal instead, and then they go up to Bree and I'll be defending. It's a fun idea that is very similar to raid mechanics that will come into the game later. This is not the only time Path 2 has had decent foresight and understood mechanics that will eventually be employed en masse by ArenaNet, and I like to see that. I think the fight mechanics would have been awesome staying like this the whole way, with us trading defenders for attackers dynamically as the encounter goes along.
I didn't see that coming.
But instead, at 50%, she speaks and things change. Now, for some reason, and I'm not sure the story explanation, everything goes haywire. We all end up out of shift, and we can all go into fight Operative Bree. She actually gets a lot more health at this point, so you really should all go attack. There's chaos everywhere, lots of AoEs, and she's reasonably dangerous, but nothing too crazy, and that's another path in the bag.
Amazing! These artifacts reveal the full story. The races gathered together to fight the dragons, each contributing something. Yet the Mursaat took their knowledge and fled into a half-world, out of phase with our own. They would have let the rest of the world die just to save themselves. Just like the Inquest.
We've had many descriptions over the years of the Mursaat leaving, going to the mists or whatnot, but here we hear of it as a half-world. What an evocative description. I wonder what a place like that would be, and if eventually we'll get some content there. I also can't help but wonder as to other mysteries of the Mursaat's backstory, such as why the Isles of Janthir, a place we know that's related to the Mursaat, look so blasted and destroyed. This path, sadly, doesn't really give us those details. There's no extra information here at Ysa. What happened even during the boss fight is difficult to interpret. And yeah, you just did see that correctly. There's a mysterious loading screen that kicks you away from the boss fight area after the fight. I think it has something to do with the terminal mechanics. If the fight was still going on, that's supposed to push us away and reset it. But I really don't know. That's Path 2. A real mixed bag that doesn't actually touch the Mursaat very much. The closest we get is the cool statue of one right here in front of the terminal, but there's no dialogue talking about how the Inquest tapped into its magic and powered it up. I'll point out that Path 2, a lot like some of the Cordicus mana paths, is another really fun one to watch good speedruns of. It can be cleared very fast. Next, we have Path 3, with a Sylvari that actually has a lot to say about upcoming stories and expansion plotlines. So honestly, I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce this Sylvari's name, but I'll say let's go with Illyra, or Ilra? Let's go with Illyra. So, Warden Atire says, I have a theory about the Forgotten and Glint. I believe I can show how Glint was freed of the control of the Elder Dragon. So, we say the Forgotten. She says they were a race of serpent people. Legends connect them to Glint, and I think they were in part responsible for freeing her. We met the Forgotten in Guild Wars 1, indeed alongside her with the Trials of Ascension. What can you tell me about Glint? Well, Glint, once known as Glaus, was a champion of the Elder Dragon Kralkatorrik. She was, until recently, a friend to all living things. We say, wait, how did a champion of an Elder Dragon, like, say, the Shatterer, become a friend to living things? The Forgotten discovered a great spell that granted Glint a will free from control by the Elder Dragon. She then concealed many of the Elder races from the dragons. So this is a story touched a little bit on in Edge of Destiny, but we're already getting a lot of new lore bombs here. That Glint's name was not always Glint. She used to be Glaus. And what? The Demon Priory just knew that? We never really hear where Ilra got that fact from, but it's become a big part of Glint's story, that she had a life before her current one, known as Glaus. Where and how Glaus was born, well, we don't know, but we can assume it's perhaps something close to how the Shatterer is being perpetually recreated in the brand, except this was during the last Elder Dragon Rising, 10,000 years ago, not this current one. So we can ask, do you know the spell that the Forgotten used? This too being a revelation, one of the major things they did during the last Elder Dragon Rising. And she says, not yet, but I am close. I believe the spell must be worked here in Arah. I must find that location. So there, we're even suggesting maybe the Forgotten were around Arah, or of course, it's just that the gods came and pilfered all the good stuff and brought it here instead. There is this last line, easy to miss. You said until recently? Is Glint dead? And she says yes. When Kralkatorrik awoke, it hunted her down and killed her. Even Destiny's Edge could not protect her. A story which the personal story and dungeon stories and the novel have all gone over very well. Glint was a major player until super recently in trying to protect the regular races of the world from the Elder Dragons that she herself had been freed from. And that was at the hands of the Forgotten. The Forgotten were around a lot just 250 years ago, but now have vanished. Even more immaculately than the dwarves, who at least we know have gone underground. Well, in Arah, we get a little bit of Forgotten backstory.
The Forgotten were an ancient race of serpents. I have learned that the last time the Elder Dragons came, the Forgotten worked with Glint, who hid the old races from the dragon's power. Glint was a champion of the Elder Dragon Kralkatorrik, but somehow she shook off his yoke. Our scouts have reported ancient artifacts, which may be tied to the Forgotten. Perhaps they hold the key for freeing creatures from the control of the dragons.
So if you really think about it, all this story is massive. Number 1, Path 2 mentioned the Mursaat hid from the Elder Dragons by shifting out of phase. But here we find that once the Forgotten had cleansed Glint and had an ally in her, she hid the rest from the Elder Dragons. How exactly she did that, why the Mursaat sought their own method of hiding instead, the dungeon and the story never really truly makes clear. But if this all just seems like irrelevant ancient history to you, consider this. If the Forgotten found a way to cleanse Elder Dragon corruption, something we've watched several times throughout the main story here be a big deal, then couldn't we in theory undo the brand? Turn these Risen we're facing right now back into regular people? Make something like the Shatterer a new Glint to help us out? It could be huge! And no, if you're wondering about Traherne's ritual at the end of the personal story and how it might be related to this path, the devs never really explain. Obviously, the timeline doesn't work out, so whatever ritual Traherne and the Derman Priory developed involving Caladbolg to cleanse ore is not the same as what the Forgotten were going with here, which seem to be more about individual creatures. All this subject material and what we're going to find in this path is wildly important. I would actually say this path of Arah is the most important thing all players should witness and experience before moving on to the later stories and expansions. It just underpins so much of what can and should happen going forwards. I want to show you guys out in this field as we wander towards the start of the path, this cliff that you could in the past, and maybe even still can to a degree, climb around on and jump behind. It's just another one of those places in Arah where you could skip into much deeper without actually having to fight many enemies on the way. Moving over to this door we entered in story mode, it closes and you get some of these rare varieties of Risen again. For example, that Defiler back there. Those are the ones that do pulsing damage around them and have the ability to pull you in tight. We're also fighting an Elementalist here. They're a more common variety of Risen, but are distinct to the mages. I don't know why they decided to name one type of Risen after a very specific Guild Wars 2 profession, but the Elementalists are really good to reflect, and haven't talked about the mechanics yet, despite appearing several times so far across Arah. I thought I may as well take this opportunity now. You'll see our first boss fight against those Risen is just in a minute. The Wraith Lord itself is interacting with a strange artifact, and when we get close, it will disappear, running away. That's our main antagonist for the entire adventure here, and we'll see it regularly in the background as we approach various artifacts of the Forgotten, leaving behind often other creatures for us to defeat in its place. This is actually one of the first dungeon paths I ever did. It gave me an impression that all dungeon paths would have such rich and exciting lore, but actually, I think this is about as good as it gets. At least in terms of importance of subject material. So we're starting to get a good picture across these three paths now of the main thing each of the ancient races did. The Jotun studied the stars and enabled decent prediction of Elder Dragon movements. The Forgotten learned how to potentially cleanse Elder Dragon corruption, as we'll see as this story goes along. The Mursaat self-interestedly sought to hide. That's just going to leave us with the Seers in Path 4 soon. So, for this boss, we have two things to fight at once. It's really fun, and I like the interaction that's going on here. First, you have the Crusher. He has these massive, enormous attacks that can one-shot our members of the party, even through tons of defenses. Luckily, he's on a huge wind-up animation that you can easily step around. Complicating matters is this Hunter, who drops traps that can immobilize you, and thus leave you in the hits from the Crusher. So, you might want to kill the Hunter, but you'll notice every time he dies, the Crusher will cast a resurrection skill. It actually looks like Healing Signet as far as the animation is concerned, but what it will do is revive the Hunter and make sure that he's pretty much always on the board. If you're quick enough at killing the Hunter, the Crusher will still be on cooldown with his Resurrect, something you could extend in the past with Chill too, and get some free damage uptime. But generally, because of the Resurrection mechanic, it's best to just kill the Crusher. If you can keep them both together, they die at once. But especially when soloing, that wasn't always the easiest thing to do. We're making this look really easy and you're not seeing the one-shots much, but it's definitely something that would catch players out until they learned how to move around. With that done, we get a cutscene. This path is actually full of them.
This artifact once belonged to the Forgotten. The golden seal matches those from the Crystal Desert. More importantly, it has remained uncorrupted either by Or's long immersion or by Zhaitan. This is important. It means that some sort of protection is possible.
Not only that, but that Wraith Lord and the lingering remains of Zhaitan's armies are interested in them still, possibly because they're full of magic. That reference to the Golden Seal is pretty excellent too. In the original game, where there were Forgotten around you could fight, if you killed them, you could get tokens, random trash junk items that were seals of the Forgotten, small golden rings. This isn't the only time Guild Wars 2 will go to lengths referencing those old items, but it is the first. A really subtle, nice bit of dialogue. We know, as Guild Wars 1 players, exactly what Warden Atire is talking about there. This next section of the dungeon involves a whole ton of running. At first, you'll just be fighting the standard fare of Risen, illusionists, mages, hunters, elementalists, but eventually opening into these wider plains, populated with small hands. We have found these in odd places in the open world and personal story, such as up the Promenade of the Gods leading into the ruined city. Remember, when they hit you, they knock you down for long periods of time, and you might want to cleave them out. They're really annoying, and often don't do much, but I really like what they add to the setting. You'll also see here patrolling are risen giants. You find a lot of them in this path, and none of them really are things you have to fight. Unlike in Path 2 with the Abomination legendary boss, you never get a formal dungeon boss fight against a risen giant, one of the other really exciting varieties, but these champion ones are available to kill if you feel so inclined. They're pretty much the same as what you'd find outside of the dungeon, with several stomp animations and long shockwaves. I'll remind you of a bit of trivia about them I mentioned a long time ago. There is an achievement in the game to kill giants, but because these are risen giants, they count as risen instead, and if you want the Giant Slayer, sadly, that means Path 3 is not your friend. You'll have to go find living ones in much earlier areas of open world Tyria. One more Malrona-style spider, and not only do we get cutscenes in this path, but other random dialogue firing from Elira, as she glimpses the Wraith Lord once again.
Careful. More of Zaitan's minions are about. They cannot corrupt the old forgotten artifacts, but they can prevent others from using them.
This is going to be our next boss fight. One of the most stationary, easy bosses in the game is the Wraith Lord's Mage Crusher. Why this was a particularly interesting boss for many years is because it is in Arah at level 80, and because it has so much vitality, and because it never really moves or dodges or does much to incapacitate you. It was the best thing to practice damaging builds with. You could come here and do a lot of damage to it, posting a YouTube video showing people, hey, look at my excellent new build and how hard it hits. These days, most raiders and endgame players have dedicated facilities for that, involving Asura golems. But this guy is kind of the original golem. He does have some abilities, these marks I'm demonstrating here. He throws them all around. Look at how far away they're appearing. I guess the designer implementing this anticipated players using a lot more terrain than we actually need in the end, and after a while, they'll detonate them for a bit of damage. But as long as you stand next to the Crusher, you'll see you can't really do anything. We can sit here, even using our whirlwind attack against the wall without actually going anywhere, for absolute maximum damage. Super fun, but mostly just to indulge in how hard you can hit things, and not for any practically well-designed reasons. With him defeated, we're now already on our way back to Lupicus.
May your knowledge flourish. Yes, yes! Look at these runes. The Forgotten were able to remove Kraukotoric's control over Glint. Glint remained in crystalline form, but she regained her free will and identity. If we can recreate the process, this will help in fighting the dragons. The spell requires a location near here. We need to find a likely place to replicate the experiment.
Damn, I get nostalgic hearing that Guild Wars 1 dungeon soundtrack playing there. Trying to interact with the Tome of the Forgotten Lore doesn't actually do anything. Elira will pick it up, spawn the chest, and we can move on. Now, I did just mention we're headed to Lupe next, but you won't recognize any of these areas. Arah is kind of fun in the way it's structured. Path 1 takes you to the far left. Path 2 takes you forwards and then left. Path 3, we've actually gone to the far right. So this entire wing of the dungeon, you've not seen anything of yet. And it means the route to Lupe is going to be different to what we saw in Path 1 and 2. It's going to involve this underwater tunnel, where we avoid some corrupted bubbles, nothing too tricky, killing some gorillas, and then a really fun puzzle that you can get very good at, especially, once again, if you have a mesmer to help carry you. The idea is to interact with this magical lamppost thing, which is housing a glowing orb. It says the sphere glows with corrosive light, and the light seems to control a nearby door. If we take some light, you'll see we're holding it, and it's doing massive damage to us. We get just one skill, and that's to throw the orb to another player. Much like in Keg Brawl and a couple of other small places in the game, this is a passing mechanic. The idea being that you pass the ball back and forward through your 5 party members, each standing still to make sure you catch it in the right place, as there's a long cast time, and slowly working it all the way over to the far side receptacle. Here, you'll see we messed up. I threw the orb at someone, but missed a little, and it was dropped. Actually, I think the Keg Brawl throwing skills, being a long pass and a short pass, were implemented a lot better than this one, and I wish the devs had just copy-pasted the lessons they'd learned from Keg Brawl into Arah, but they never did in the end. I suppose it's not a big problem, just something that might have been a little bit nice. You'll see I do still get my utility skills, and on that successful run, I was able to use Bull's Rush to create a bigger gap and carry the orb further before I have to pass it. That first door was pretty simple, but now you'll see we have a really long road to travel down. A single player can quite handily solo that first one with something like Bull's Rush or a teleport, but to get all the way down here, well, that's a lot trickier. In truth, as a warrior, I could use the heal skill Defiant stance that would turn damage into healing to allow me to carry the orb really far. Get it to almost kill me, use the heal skill, then the orb heals me to 100%, and then it has to damage me all the way again. In the meantime, I've been running all the way down the corridor. I'm going to show you another technique though, where our Mesmer waits at the end of the corridor, placing a portal there. And then, later, the Mesmer can place his exit portal about where I'm jumping right now. That means the rest of the team, 4 players, only have to get the orb about halfway through the routes, nowhere near as challenging as you might think. The trick here really is to use your profession skills to make things easier. Teleporters, gap creators, things like Portal. I've been in many pugs where people have struggled here for, not joking, hours. And it's not just because of a lack of coordination or communication, but people not thinking outside of the box and utilizing the rest of their stuff. Here you'll see, my team tried to pass it to me on this rock, and I would have walked to the portal, but the orb missed. So now, we have to try again. For this run, I'll show you the perspective of being the player who picks up the orb in the first place, and here's how we successfully accomplished it. You'll actually do this sequence in both Path 3 and 4, so it's worth practicing and getting used to this. I opens with a Bull's Rush, my ally stands still while I'm healed and throw the orb to him here. Now we can just run ahead to about the halfway point with our Mesmer's waiting portal, travelling through and entering on the far side. The doors open, and we're back out at the top of the staircase that looks out over the camp at the beginning of the dungeon. This is the same walk down to Lupe, and we can just rush on through. You will have noticed, hopefully, that every time we get back to Lupe, the different NPC we have has a different remark on what they see or think about it. I really like the Sylvari one, and I wonder if the devs are hinting at some secret as yet untold.
That body looks like a Giganticus lupicus, corrupted by Zaitan's power. They became extinct long before the first Sylvari fell off the tree.
It doesn't look extinct. It's moving.
Is it? Amazing!
They became extinct long before the Sylvari are around. First of all, that's quite an evocative idea, but second, what if it's a hint? We already have heard these theories that maybe the Sylvari awoke specifically to battle the Elder Dragons. So what if they did on the last cycle too, and we just don't know about it? And she's wrong here. What if the Sylvari were around and every bit as old as the Giganticus lupicus?
Such a titanic creature leashed to Zaitan's power. Perhaps we may free its brethren, if they still exist.
So Alira recognizes that that's not a regular Giganticus lupicus, that it is an undead one. I'd love to see another, maybe still flesh and blood variety one day. Here you'll see when we speak to her, an extra options appeared that says, what are you planning to do with this chicken? You'd be forgiven for wondering what the hell that's all about. We haven't seen any chickens, have we? That's not Tyrix referring to Lupe as one big chicken, like in the Commando trailer.
Get down. We've got him coming. That's a big chicken.
No, what's actually happened here is a bug. Unfortunately, that spoiled something that's as yet upcoming in the path, and for some reason, the dialogue triggers early. Even worse, once we do see the aforementioned chicken in just a moment, that conversation option will disappear again. So the only way to know what she thinks about the chicken we're about to find is to talk to her about it before we find it. Really irritating. but I do at least enjoy that of all the NPCs, at least Elira's dialogue is updating as we progress throughout the dungeon. Many of the others have their starting dialogue from start to finish. You'll notice a familiar labyrinthine running section here as we move away from Lupe and now into a totally different area of the dungeon as a different door is opened up. Cleaving these spiders down isn't too much of a hassle, and eventually you'll come into this red room where, yeah, there's a cage.
This looks very interesting.
A classic repeating dialogue bug there. There used to be a lot more of these.
This creature is perfect.
It's a chicken. An undead chicken.
Yes, it is. But it is clearly tainted, while still small enough to contain. Place the undead chicken into this cage, and we'll take it to the altar described in the spell. Okay, I've got the chicken in the cage. We must press on to the altar and work the spell that freed Glint. Study the past to survive the future.
There's something really funny to me still about this path and the fact it revolves around an undead chicken. Here you'll see they even went to the lengths of giving her an animation to hold it. Really funny. It's not the first time we've been dealing with undead chickens either. There was an event in Malkor's Leap that particularly springs to mind with an Inquest ornithologist looking into them. Of course, the Hall of Monuments does have as one of its main rewards a mini baby undead chicken. Well, this one's an adult. We're going to be taking it and try to cleanse it. Is it true that tapping into forgotten magics and rituals, we can actually cleanse Elder Dragon corruption? Well, this chicken can be our guinea pig. We're very close to the end of the path now. You'll notice that instead of in some of the other paths, where we have a full boss there, like Korga or Alphard, Serpent of the Waves.
Up there is the altar.
Instead, we just open a cage. There's no boss or actual sequence to deal with there. This region name is the Grand Basilica, and it's basically a giant bowl-shaped room with the altar in the middle and 3 giants patrolling in a ring. The giants, just like all these other things, are optional. You can walk past them and they won't necessarily fight you. But I wonder if it was the developers' expectation we would kill those giants that made them think, okay, we don't need a mini-boss too. There's 3 frickin' giants to get through here. I love taking the time to look over this ramshackle barricade here. You'll notice that's actually where we fought Operative Belka in Path 2, right near the start. I did mention to you all that we'd have another glimpse into that area later, and it's these moments of dungeons I always really enjoy, where I feel like I must be miles away from everything else that's happening, but instead, we're actually very tightly interwoven around the same places. It's cool to think of that while in story mode, and riding those airships so many miles away so fast, and thinking below the fog just how many different things could be, theoretically, packed tightly close to one another, adventures that we could have had, but we skip on over, moving at high speeds. You'll see here, the giants aren't too difficult to take out. You will get more of a taste of their various animations. The big stomps are probably one of the most visually noisy effects out there in the game, but since they don't spawn champion giants in that many areas, it doesn't matter too much. I think that the reason that ArenaNet might have expected us as players to always want to kill these instead of skipping them is that giants can siege a lot with large boulder attacks that are long range. Maybe they imagined that if you skipped these giants and simply went to the altar, they'd siege you from down below. But their AI doesn't aggro from that far away, and it's a component of the fight that actually means nothing. I have a lot of strong, happy memories being right here around the altar, just because it was the end, like I said, of one of the first explorable dungeon paths I ever did, and standing here represented having gone through hours of effort. The way up to the altar is actually around the back, kind of subtly disguised on this cliff face you have to walk along. Once we're up there, we'll have the final encounter and discover just exactly what it was the Forgotten were capable of.
Up the slope. We need to reach the altar.
You'll get a point of interest at the end of this path called the Altar of Glaus. It means this giant thing we're walking around, buried into the rock, is the altar. Look at how enormous this thing is. We didn't really associate the Forgotten with particularly large structures and architecture in the first game, but Guild Wars 2 is demonstrating a whole side of them we knew nothing about.
This is the altar. It was here before the human gods came that Glint was freed of the Elder Dragons. With luck, we can reproduce the original spell. Protect me and the chicken while we perform the ritual.
Elira seems to have suggested several times now that actually the altar is not here because the gods brought it here, but because instead this is where the Forgotten chose to do their ritual. I guess that means, if this all works out, that cleansing dragon corruption is only possible at certain places in Tyria. Maybe Ore is one such place because of the source below it and all the energy that also drew the gods to this place. May have even drawn Zaitan to eventually sleep here. Don't forget, this cleansing we're talking about would have been while Zaitan was last awake, and he could have been anywhere on Tyria during this time. Beating the final encounter involves defeating the Wraith Lord, who we've had glimpses of the whole way through the dungeon. There are two things to do. First, charge the ritual and make him vulnerable. Second, actually kill him. Right now we need to charge the ritual. You see on the top right we have a progress meter, but unlike many progress meters in the game, this one can go both up and down based on how you're doing. Around the altar are 3 territories that we, the players, need to own. While you might expect this to work exactly the same as other territories in the game, such as in PvP or various dynamic events, the mechanics here are a little bit different. Basically, to keep a territory for your team, you need more players in the ring than there are enemies. But you don't need to always stand in them. It's more like you're flipping the territories in and out of your favor. So once you've claimed one, you can walk away, like you see I did here. The objective is obviously to split your team up. This used to be really difficult, and so instead, players would use a tactic of having most of the team in the center of the altar, with the Wraiths aggro running in circle, so that they never actually went to the territories, while one other player simply went around and flipped them in the team's favor. The last complication is the main Wraith Lord himself, who does massive damage if you stand near him, and also, of course, counts as an enemy that will contest your territories. The smoothest way to beat this is to just always fight for the territories the main boss isn't standing at. If you try and contest them with him, you might end up defeated, like my ally here I'm in the middle of reviving. The encounter is easier and less chaotic than it looks. You just need to have the majority of the territory points in your favor to gain ritual progress. So even if temporarily you allow the Risen to have more territories, it's not a big deal. You'll notice at the top right, you're probably still gaining ritual progress, just slowly and steadily. If you're using the technique where you're kiting the wraiths around, do be warned. They are largely melee, but they also have life siphon skills that can very suddenly and aggressively kill you. Make sure you stand away from them. They're a lot like what Lupicus does in Phase 3 as he's dying, in that they'll create these big red rings that pulse lifesteal over time. They are tanky foes, and because they lifesteal, if you're going to go for a method where you try to kill them, you need to be aggressive about that plan and keep the bulk of your players together. You'll see here, we are slowly winning, just making sure that wherever the Wraith Lord goes, we do not go. Instead, always battling for the territories he's not around. He'll rotate every maybe 15 to 20 seconds. I've honestly never properly timed it. And before long, you'll have the ritual progress complete. He'll get particularly annoyed, and you're on to part 2, which is actually killing him. The ritual animation is pretty gorgeous. All these white lights appear at first around the pillar, then expanding across the entire altar, dazzling the whole place in a brilliant white light. If you look closely, you'll see Elira place the chicken on the floor during this time, and its name will update dynamically. It's now called a free-willed risen chicken. Though, if you're not close to look at that, you might not realise anything's happened at all. Let's talk about the Wraith Lord boss himself. He's basically a pushover. He has this vomit ability. If you eat multiple hits of it, it stacks this debuff called Corruption on you that does damage and eventually will stun you, spawning more Wraith allies for him. We already saw he can spawn tons of Wraiths in the previous phase, but that doesn't factor in very much on this wave. Usually he'll die before you see many of them appear at all. Especially with break bars in the game, you can keep him stunned and stack massive damage to basically boil through him. I was really trying to get hit by more corruption to show you that mechanic here, but try as I might, it wasn't really possible. You'll see that his flavor text says that he steals health and also fears. I really can't remember when or how that fear animation triggers. I certainly have no memory of it. And as you'll see on this run, we kill him before there's any chance for that to go through, even if we are holding back a bit. So this is it. The big moment. Can we cleanse dragon corruption from living things?
Excellent. Look at the clarity in its eyes, the lack of murderous rage. I will call it Twitchy. Ogden will be so impressed.
The answer is yes. I like how she says Ogden will be impressed. It's the one hint that maybe Ogden would have something to say about these stories, but we never get to regroup with him and actually have any dialogue. Here you have it. The name's changed again now to become Twitchy, the allied risen chicken. It's no longer angry and will be our friend. You'll notice it didn't come back to life. It's not made of flesh and feather. It still looks ugly as hell, but it has regained its former sense of self. So that's still a pretty huge victory. I'll remind you guys that in 2012, this was it. The end of the road for the story. When we finished the dungeon explorable path, you just had to wonder where the devs would take it in the future. And on this path in particular, you have to think, surely they can't leave this kind of thing lingering. That's just too important. We now have access to an altar that can bring people back. What if I find Risen Tibble out there? Can I get him back by bringing him to the altar? What about all the other countless people that we lost throughout this story that had to be cut down and are still ambling around in awe? What about the Branded and the Icebrood? What about using this somehow on the Shatterer? Surely we can have some epic story now where we try to capture the Shatterer, bring it here, and get ourselves a new Glint. Well, and shamefully so, I will say, none of that ever happens. Since the end of this path, the devs have pretty much acted as though it doesn't exist. The Altar of Glaus, as a function of Glint's backstory, definitely is something that is considered for the future, but the actual Pact's ability to use it has never been touched on again. Don't get me wrong, I totally understand why the developers have probably never looked back at this. It feels like a bit of fringe lore being hidden in one of these explorable paths that not all players have done, that fundamentally messes with the stakes of the story they're telling. How bad is the Elder Dragon threat when most of the people who fall victim to them can now be brought back? But what I do find unpalatable is their decision to ignore the existence of the Altar of Glaus and its applications for the future, instead of writing in some extra story about how maybe the altar became depowered, or we lost control of the forgotten magic, or the cave in Arah collapsed so we couldn't touch it anymore, and now we need to find another one. Any of these extra stories could have been tacked on to explain this massive plot hole, but the devs never did it. If you think it sounds pretty bad right now with my explanation, just wait until the expansion stories, one of which seriously revolves around this idea of Elder Dragon corruption and coming back from it, but never do we look back at the Altar of Glaus. This dungeon path is something of a highlight and also something of a lowlight when it comes to Guild Wars 2 for me. Last for us to play is Arah Path 4, the elusive extra path. When it came to designing the final dungeon, the devs clearly upped the ante as far as mechanics and grueling challenges go. But what's brilliant is that then, even after the first 3 paths, they added one final, epic 4th one. It's far longer than any other dungeon path in the entire game, particularly if you'll be defeating everything, and was obviously supposed to be the ultimate challenge. I wonder, had we got 5 paths in the end, if this instead would have been shorter, and P5 would have been the really tricky one? 5 paths would have left this dungeon a bit like the Domain of Anguish in Guild Wars 1, in that you had 4 wings and then a final one. I like to imagine that that's the route they were going to go with, but as we all know, history never went that way. The final path is with a human, Randall Greystone, and the devs kind of cheat a little bit. Yeah, we're going to be looking at the last ancient race now, the Seers, but also we're going to be looking a lot at the human gods at the same time. I do appreciate they found a way to make this combination. As cool as the ancient races are, it just wouldn't have made sense to have Arah, the city of the gods, be a dungeon that doesn't even really talk about the gods much. Its forgivable story didn't. After all, that's all about the Elder Dragon. But we have to get some god lore somewhere in here, right? Well, we're going to get it alongside the Seers. And why? Well, for that, we'll have to speak to Randall Greystone.
We know so little.
I'll take a second at the head to point out the way that Randall looks. He's actually deliberately modelled after someone in the real world, a man named Mike O'Brien, who is one of the 3 founders of ArenaNet, the studio that makes Guild Wars 2. This final path is kind of an homage to their boss then, I guess. Mike was actually one of the game directors for a while also, which means that 2 of the Guild Wars 2 game directors, both this character here and the enemy dredge, Zardogony in Sorrow's Embrace, are actually represented in dungeons. Kind of funny. I suppose it's a real flattery putting your boss in the final epic dungeon path, but it's even more extreme than it may first appear. Try to remember this fact about Randall as you watch what happens to the story of this character as Path 4 goes along. He opens by saying, "I study the Seers, an enigmatic, magical race. I believe they were responsible for the forging of the Bloodstone." Let's take a quick second to remind ourselves of what we're talking about here. The Seers did appear in Guild Wars 1, nowhere near as much as the Dwarves, nowhere near as much as the Forgotten, nowhere near as much as the Mursaat, but they were there, a dying out, almost extinct race that helped you with their last gasp guard against some of the Mursaat's deadly magics. It was established in the first game that the Seers, as a race, went to war with the Mursaat. The both of them, after the prior Elder Dragon Rising, ended up falling out, it seems, and almost destroyed one another. We know about that war, that it lasted potentially thousands of years, but didn't get to see much of it, and hardly interacted with the Seers at all. It makes them probably the most mysterious of the ancient races, and is likely why Randall's using that word enigmatic there. Then we have the Bloodstones. Up until now, there was no connection between the Seers and the Bloodstones. We knew so little about them after all. The Bloodstone lore is separate, and we had a pretty clear picture about it in Guild Wars 1, that it's what the gods used to give magic to the races of Tyria, and then, when things went wrong, they took it back, much to Abaddon's chagrin, breaking it into separate pieces, maybe representing various schools of magic, and throwing them into an active volcano as one final precaution. But it turns out now, as we visit Arah 250 years later, that the story is more complicated than that. It seems all the lore we read during Guild Wars 1 was really just the human understanding of the Bloodstones, and in fact, the gods never made them at all. Instead, as Randall will show, the Seers did. I'm explaining this now so that you guys understand. This is actually new, uncharted territory for the franchise, to draw a connection between Seers and Bloodstones where there wasn't one before. I've seen some players grumpy about this in the past, like this is some kind of soft retcon, but to me it is plausible. I remember being a bit confused myself the first time I read this. I assumed it was that I'd missed some crucial story somewhere in the personal story or open world that went into the detail more, but no, it is all just appearing now, as told by Randall. So we can ask, what can you tell me about the Seers? He says not much is known. They were an elder race, alive when the Elder Dragons first awoke. They allied with the Forgotten, the Dwarves, the Jotun and the Mursaat to resist the Elder Dragons, and they survived. Interesting that Randall seems to think the prior rising was the first rising. Not necessarily. Tyrix can say at this point, weren't the Seers and Mursaat enemies? Which is a fantastic line of dialogue. It's obviously there in recognition of the fact the devs knew Guild Wars 1 players would be wondering about it. But you have to ask yourself, why does Tyrix know that fact, that the Mursaat and Seers were enemies? Yeah, it's common knowledge amongst us as nerds in the real world that played Guild Wars 1, but does that also mean it's common knowledge amongst modern day Tyrians 250 years ago, and particularly the Char? What do the Char care about Seers and Mursaat? Maybe Tyrix is just one smart guy. Never underestimate what the Vigil will teach you. He says indeed they were enemies. They did work together once, but the Mursaat betrayed the other races and fled from the world, returning as the Unseen Ones, hinting a bit at Path 2 there. We can say, what can you tell me about their Bloodstone? And he says, I believe that the Seers gathered up the uncorrupted magic, including that of the Jotun, and put it within the original Bloodstone. It's interesting to me that he specifically mentions Jotun magic separate from everything else. Why is that important? Was there a deeper story about Jotun magic that the devs never got round to telling us, but P4 was assuming we'd know about? Again, Tyrix can have the voice of a Guild Wars 1 player. I thought the human gods created the Bloodstone, he says. And Randall says no, the gods found the stone and used it to give magic to my people. When the humans couldn't handle it, the gods broke it into parts. You might have heard another small contradiction in Randall's explanation there, that the humans were the only beneficiaries of the Bloodstone. Well, we know that's not necessarily right. Several lesser races seem to have been. Even the Jotun in Holbrack acknowledged that much. I do think this unreliable narration supports the game here for what it's worth. It allows us to more comfortably question everything Randall's saying, even maybe some of these new details about the Seers.
The Seers were a magical race, and once close allies to the Mursaat. When the Elder Dragons first awoke, they gathered the unspoiled magic in the world and locked it within a great artifact, the first Bloodstone. The human gods recovered this Bloodstone and gave magic to the human race. When humanity could not handle that power, they split it into 5 parts. The first Bloodstone was broken into pieces in Arah. I've modified an Asuran device to follow divine energies. I think we can find shards from that event, and perhaps its location.
Modified an Asuran device, eh? I wonder if this is another slight nod to the very old energy detector. I like the idea of having a a very old energy divine detector. But they never go quite far enough to truly say that. It seems that Randall's dialogue does reference, at least in part, several of the events of the other paths, and I wonder whether the devs did design this expecting you to have played it all. For this adventure, we're going to establish the pattern set up by the other paths too. We went left, then forward left, then right. This time, we'll be going forward right. I did want to show you this pull again from Path 3. We never had enough time to talk about it last time. Just standing by this rock, you can beat up a hell of a lot of enemies. There's only 2 mages that will really threaten you. It's the mages that have been doing these big water spouts. Very elementalisty looking, but they're not actually elementalists. They're enemies that really you don't have much opportunity to reflect, and thus make them some of the more deadly opponents here in Arah. This path is going to deal a lot, not just with the human gods and Randall and the Seers, but actually the Pact in general too, with several groups of Pact allies for us to help out along our way, including this group right here at the start by this door. They don't spawn if you're on Path 2, but they'll be standing here on P4.
Stand clear! She's about to blow!
Those bombs are a nice animation and touch. It's very easy to miss. They'll knock this through, and the route for the last adventure is laid bare. The risen that actually bursts out of this are really weak. The idea isn't that they'll genuinely threaten this group of soldiers. That'll happen in a second as we run down this corridor and find a champion risen knight, enough to scare them off.
Hold positions, troops! Mission aborted!
Knights are, once again, one of the most badass types of risen, and this will be one of our main fights against them here in P4. I don't know why the devs added those NPCs to run off scared, but I have a feeling it's got something to do with making us feel like a badass. This is the final endgame path, and seeing regular NPCs utterly terrified by monsters we're just tearing through now has a nice effect of making me feel pretty godly. You'll see here that this next room has a Balthazar statue in the middle and is surrounded by these elite hounds of Balthazar. Yep, they're exactly the same as the elite skill humans can cast. They'll leap at you with fiery damage and actually be quite dangerous. They are elites and at level 80, but their animations are slow enough that you should be able to dodge them. What's important about these hounds, the mystery as to why they're here will be revealed in a second, are that as they die, they drop these fiery orbs. You can pick them up and move them around.
Lord Audron once sought out the gods. Perhaps we need to seek them out again.
Why is it always orbs in Arah that we're moving? As Randall says, the idea is we're going to try and get the attention of the gods. Maybe they'll help us with this mystery to do with the Seers and the Bloodstone. We know that the gods did have something of a connection to the Forgotten, but the Seers? Not so much. How did they end up getting the stone if it was the Seers that made it? Did you notice how in the original cutscene too, Randall suggested this is just the first of the Seers Bloodstones we're dealing with? Does that mean there are other intact ones out there, far away?
Zaitan will enslave you!
Balthazar would be outraged to see his priests corrupted so.
With all 3 hounds killed, and you have to kill them for the orbs, you can place them in the braziers around the statue, and it will summon Kaisar, the High Priest of Balthazar. He has this active effect, suggesting he's drawing power from a nearby Bloodstone shard. So just like in the open world, once again, we have high priests associated with the gods that have been corrupted by Zaitan. And in fact, just as in the open world, not only did we open with the Balthazar temple there, it was the first one you found, it's the Balthazar one here first too. I like that the devs preserved that ordering. In Guild Wars 1, Balthazar was the patron god of warriors, and thus, this boss is going to pretty much act just like one.
You can
cannot defeat the Elder Dragons.
Not too tricky to take out these days, but in the past, you might want to range away from that Axe 5. It can really chunk you down.
No! My power betrays me!
I do like how Randall mentioned Lord Odrin there, and that we're kind of following in his footsteps.
Look there! That gem upon the creature's head. That's a shard of the Bloodstone. It matches my research. I knew there had to be small pieces from when the human gods sundered it. We must recover it.
At this point, we know that Zaitan and his minions were very keen on magical artifacts, so what we observe here makes a ton of sense.
Interesting. I think Zaitan's minions are attracted to the power of these stones.
They definitely would still be ambling around here, attracted to the power. Randall's dialogue updates after each boss for this path. We can say, what was that creature? And he says, a corrupted avatar of Balthazar, the god of war. Zaitan's power was immense to have corrupted an aspect of the gods. And we say, no question, Zaitan was a monstrously powerful entity. Again, I love that we can actually talk in concrete terms about what Tyrix thinks having killed an Elder Dragon. In terms of implementation, this path was probably not too bad for the devs. You can already guess what they'll be going for. Each boss, a corrupted, undead servant of Zaitan that mirrors the open world's temple meta events, where they can reuse the creature's unique-looking models and animations. I do think there is value in this, because fighting things in the open world, where it's basically a question of just zerging stuff down, is different to playing in structured 5-man environments where the game is more balanced to be genuinely difficult and punishing. The fact they opened with Balthazar both times, I do kind of like, especially with regard to future stories, but I'll stop myself before we get a little bit too spoilery. Most of the running sections in Path 4 aren't that different to the running sections elsewhere. The bullet hell, jumping puzzly phase rooms are just as weak as they had been in the other paths, and there's also dotted lots of extra chambers that really don't mean or do much. Like, what is this weird room with a glowing light in the back? Were we supposed to carry orbs all the way down this, or do some mechanic that eventually they decided they didn't want to go for? With other dungeon paths, cut content doesn't exactly surprise me, because I assume that they're trying to keep all paths of roughly equal length. But Path 4 was definitely throwing that to the wind, not caring how long it ended up, and being a celebration of that classic dungeoneering endurance test we saw so much of in Guild Wars 1. So why would they cut stuff out? Maybe it's purely a matter of time crunch? It feels almost like with Arah, the environment designer for the dungeon that actually placed all the geometry around, did it without much or any understanding of what the content designers would later go through and populate it with. So you end up with these extra rooms that the environment designer had ideas for, but the rest of the team never had the time or inclination to actually utilize. This next large open chamber is where we'll fight the next boss, but we have to go through a bit of an adventure to spawn it. There's some really subtle stuff going on here that players have to engage their brains to figure out. First are these elite Orion gorillas. The gorillas are just as deadly as any of the other ones we've fought so far, but these will infinitely respawn.
May Cormyr enlighten you. That font of light, I sense that it is strongly divided.
As you can guess from that point of interest name, the Milan Zoo's dome, Milan Zoo will be the next boss we fight. It's weird because later in this path, there'll be a truly beautiful, naturey looking area. You would have thought they'd put the Milan Zoo boss, but instead, she's here. As I mentioned, the gorillas do infinitely respawn, it just takes them a long time. While that's going on, we have to figure out how to spawn the boss. If you look closely, you'll see there is a stump in this small side chamber that we can't press F to interact with, but there are buckets of poison in the room too, and should you use the bucket of poison on the stump, you'll grow a poisonous tree. The poisonous tree will release these strange energy balls that knock you back and do damage if you go near them, that continue moving into the center of the room. Some of the trees are already grown when you enter, giving you a hint as to what you need to do, and several other ones have to be manually grown by us with the poison buckets. I got these, while some other members of the party split up and go to get the ones on the far side. You'll see over here there is a Milan Zoo statue and a vine wall, but that's not really relevant.
There's another one. Again, it has a shard of the Bloodstone.
That's a cool mechanic. The idea of walking into a room and seeing the yellow text showing there's something there, but it's not just a matter of pressing F on it, I really like, and I wish the devs would employ a bit more throughout the game. So with the boss spawned, all we have to do is kill it. This guy's actually extremely tanky, and in the past, I would spend 10, 15, 20 minutes at a time slowly grinding him to death with ranged weapons from the side. But these days, we do enough damage to move in. He's extremely unique in that he summons these trees, Vahid's Flora. They can root you in place and explode after a while, doing good damage. I actually farmed my Plant Slayer achievement right here in this dungeon, killing the trees because they're set up to be plants. It's much easier to break these than to go finding rarely respawning and tanky oak hearts out in the open world after all. You notice the team starts to struggle here. That's because those gorillas I mentioned earlier did respawn right as we aggroed. Everyone resurrects, and we decide to pull away for a second to finish them off. The gorillas used to be considered threatening and tanky enough that one way to beat the mission was to actually have a single player aggro them and consistently run away from them for the entire duration of the boss fight, so everyone else could just 4v1 the main guy in the middle without worrying about the gorillas respawning. But here, even in the case they jump you mid-fight, you can pull out, kill them like you just watched we did, and then move back in. I really like this tree animation, and the fact that when they break, they collapse similar to the logging animations when you gather trees down in the open worlds. And I wonder why more plant-themed creatures throughout the game have never done anything similar. This is almost totally unique as far as Guild Wars is concerned. You do obviously have the poison balls moving around. They can keep you knock-lock chained for a long time. So if you're not good sidestepping them, as honestly, I'm not, you should consider running some stability to shrug them off. That's about it for Vahid. You'll notice he's very different to the version of him we fight in the God Temple. I wonder what that one would look like if he could summon forests on an entire Zerg of players.
This corrupted spawn of Zaytan is sadly alive. Let me recover the Bloodstone Shard. Do they seek to consume the power of the Bloodstones, or to corrupt it?
Randall just asked a really big and important question. Is the purpose of the Elder Dragons the consumption or the corruption? They seem to do both. We asked, what did we just fight? And he says a corrupted avatar of Milan Zoo, the god of nature. How powerful are these Elder Dragons? To which we can say, their power is terrifying. These extra bits of dialogue aren't the best, but I'd definitely rather getting a little update in his take compared to nothing at all. This next room sees us unite with some more Pact to help out, and the start of a really fantastic mini-story.
Hey, I need your help.
We have this new named ally, Mursaat, the Whisper's agent. Our objective is to keep her alive against these oncoming Risen, which triggers a whole sequence a lot of players who just skip this stuff don't get to enjoy.
Thank you for lending me a hand. Ready your weapons and move in.
She'll run on in, leading the charge. You'll notice around her are a ton of other slain Pact. So our assumption here is to believe that she's the lone survivor of some fight we never got to help out with, perhaps while we were still fighting with the High Priest of Milan Zoo. A lot of players won't have noticed all those bodies in the environment art, but you really should try to remember them for just a minute.
Couldn't have done it without you.
Thankful for our help clearing down these abominations and random enemies, Mursaat will now open this door by hammering away at it, allowing us to get back into the open fields we saw back during Path 3. There are, of course, a ton of spiders for us to take out, but these fields we did walk down before. If you looked very closely while playing Part 3, I never mentioned it in the commentary, but we did pass by a corrupted statue of Lissa. And well, that's where we're headed now for our next boss and our next Bloodstone Shard. The corrupted statues are very cool to look at in this mission. It's one of the easiest ways to admire all the small pieces of detail the developers put on their corrupted, fallen states, with lights on their hands or eyes or other particularly prominent areas. Another Malrona-style spider slain with our hugely inflated damage numbers to enjoy. And the Lissa statue is just a short walk away. I do wonder with these things, which high priest took precedence? The ones with their own full cathedrals out in the rest of Or, or the ones that had the privilege of working and worshipping right here in the city of the gods itself? Mursaat is really keen on getting to the statue. Why? It's because she's a clone. Look at that animation as she shatters.
Must die.
and the boss is revealed. How beautifully mesmery. We saw a little bit of this in the personal story, but I cannot get enough of undead, cunning, manipulative, tricksy, risen mesmers. This boss, for many years, was utterly broken. As mesmer patches came into the game, many of her skills and interactions fundamentally changed, making this potentially one of the most dangerous bosses in all the dungeons. First, she can moomorph one of us, as you'll see here, potentially eliminating you from the fight. And every now and then, at phases, she'll spawn a ton of clones of all the players in the party. If she chooses to shatter them, and particularly with balance in the past, that could mean inflicting you with ungodly stacks of confusion. Remember, when they first made Arah, confusion couldn't stack in intensity, and so when that changed with the game in general, it made this encounter much more challenging. Thankfully, for us, she wasn't too bad today.
Death welcomes me.
The corrupted Lissan priest is down. These shards, they feel warm now. Perhaps the bloodstones are still connected to the 6 gods.
So I guess all those bodies we saw when we first met Mursaat is actually a sign that it was a Risen who'd killed one of those Pact and then posed as a survivor just to trick us later once it got to the statue. Randall says that that was a corrupted avatar of Lissa, the twin goddess of beauty and illusion. He remarks that no wonder my gods have fled this world. Specifically, that idea of them being just his gods, I quite like. It acknowledges that sometimes the player might be something like this, a char, and wouldn't necessarily appreciate that as our god too. Randall made a really interesting observation there too, that the Bloodstones may still be connected to the 6 gods, even though they're so distant and long gone. How can that be? And especially remember that what we're actually looking into are the Seers, the original architects of the Bloodstones. So how does that fit into all of this? The path is now reunited with where we saw we were in Path 3. It took us a whopping 3 full boss fights to get here, and now we also have this extra orb puzzle to do, but everything is stuff you've seen now until after the Lupicus fight. So let's have a look at the 4th and final attempt at killing Lupicus, and as I promised you in the previous part, I will show you a really amazing way of completely destroying him and moving through one of the hardest fights in the whole game with ease.
Amazing! This dead creature predates the human gods here.
Look out, it's moving.
By the 6 gods, now it's one more slave to Zaitan.
Oh, did I note that it's kind of cool we get commander dialogue here? So here's the technique to pretty much insta-kill Lupe. First, there's a mechanic going on with how he moves. You can actually manipulate Lupe's position based on exactly how you stand. Here's some footage of me doing this in Path 2 that we'd previously cut through. What I'm going to do is target Lupe, so I get the red circle below his feet, and as long as I stand near the edge of the circle, he'll always slowly seek to walk away from me. By dodging his kicks and various other animations very carefully, I can do this to push him wherever I like, such as against this wall. With Lupe specifically against a wall, we can use skills like our Greatsword 3 to impact with extra damage. The rest of the team can come in, I can stack might and give banners, get our damage as high as possible, and we're going to push him to 75% health, where he'll go to phase 2 with that giant nuke and all the projectiles. At precisely this point, and watch closely, when the big animation triggers, my Mesmer is going to cast a reflect bubble halfway up the wall. Then, when Lupe uses the giant nuke, every single one of his projectiles will reflect back on him, killing him outright. If you don't push him against the wall and put the reflect bubble or wall of reflection if you're a guardian or whatever up the wall, most of the projectiles won't be reflected as they're too high. But using the wall cut technique, you can kill the boss like he's nothing. I love that. It's like a secret way of taking out one of the most iconic bosses in the game. Requires reasonable understanding of how Guild Wars 2 works and a bit of practice to get everything set up right, but the payoff is well worth it. Path 4 continues along now into the final door. This area, the God Path Gardens. This is where a lot of the area names will start becoming really exotic. The God Path Gardens, imagine this place before it became corrupted and how well tended its plant life might have been. There's also this crashed airship here called the Wreck of the Scorch Razor. Carla Scorchrazor being such a fundamental and important hero of the Char that the Pact actually named an airship after her. All the wrecks are badass, and the only other ones we found were in story. That really drives home to me how heavy they're hitting with this final, last path in the whole game. This next sequence is pretty small. It's something attentive players are probably more than familiar with from the open world, where we have anti-aircraft risen turrets shooting down Pact reinforcements and choppers in the sky. The idea here is that there are actually a lot of Pact around, beyond Lupe, like that Crusader that crouched down in the background, and we need to help evacuate them. There's no dialogue formalizing this. You kind of just get a feel for it as you go. So, we're going to walk through, breaking 3 separate Orion air towers, as they're described on the user interface in the top right, to allow a chopper to come down and extract our forces. Most players won't stay to look, but there is a full animation sequence coded here to see everyone escape out and back into the skies. Again, this just makes me think of story and what it was like for us to be up there on these airships, and all the people that got shot down fighting off against dragons, the fates that might have befallen them. Hey, at least we get to save a couple in the explorable mode.
Knowledge is the greatest treasure.
Oh, and what a beautiful environment. Arah's pretty clever in that each of its isolated little sections we travel through, they often shift the color palette a lot, making places that are actually quite close to one another feel very separate, just because the lighting is so different. This next room is Grenth's room, and we'll find the High Priest for the God of Death in this one. It's first of all really smart to wander around, clearing out some hidden pop-up groups. Again, Guild Wars 2 didn't do this anywhere near as much as Guild Wars 1, but in some places, it's still alive and well. Enemies hiding, that will ambush you when you're not expecting it. With the room cleared, you'll notice there's a single statue of Grenth in the center, but nothing much really going on. Instead, it's at the back of the room we have an enemy. And you'll notice as well that dotted around the chamber are these necromancer-looking black wells. That's all something that we have to interact with. So let's talk about the wraiths first of all. They have this screech attack, some chill application, and regular attacks. But when you start hitting this wraith, it will disappear, teleporting to one of the other wells in the room, regenerating its health really quickly with an effect called Grenth's Blessing. It looks like regeneration on the buff bar. And then, once it's back up at 100, it'll teleport and try and fight us again. Because we hit it so hard, really, it's just yo-yoing backwards and forwards right now. Every time it successfully teleports, it also summons minions, these Orion villagers and servants that will try to fight us. So this is an interesting moment where we have to split the team. You can do it with very few players, but you'd need high mobility. The idea being that once you hit the wraith in one location, you need to hit it again in the next one before Grenth's Blessing allows it to heal, and then you can damage a bit further. The problem is, every few percent, this wraith is gonna try and flee. First to one of these wells, then another one, then another one, then another one. And if your team isn't spread out ready and waiting for it to appear, it'll get away and eventually manage to heal up, like you can watch here. It heals and returns to where I am. So, we're going to spread around the room and slowly, anticipating where it might move, get ready to kill it. So I'll do the damage here. It will teleport over to that other section where my teammates need to get the damage quickly. Then, it will teleport to the next where my teammates need to get the damage quickly. Then, once it hits 70%, you'll see it on the far side of the chamber, where once again, we need a player to be ready to actually hit it. Lastly, it will go in the middle. You'll notice there are 5 wells and 5 players on the team. So this shouldn't be too much of a problem. But sadly, one of our players as a support can't really do much damage and is instead choosing to roam around, currently in an Asura power suit. What you can do is have a single player take control of multiple territories, and that's what you can see how my ranger is doing in the distance. Not only are they covering the middle well, but they're also covering the well to the left. The Wraith has an entirely predictable pattern that cycles at 50% health, so you can always know where it'll go next. And if you have very few players, say you're trying to sell because you're soloing or duoing, it's a really good idea to not damage too fast, thus allowing your friends to actually get themselves ready and position for the next anticipated location. With the Wraith dead, we spawn the High Priest, Garsem, and can do the rest of the fight. I really like these Orion names. I wonder if anyone's taken them as characters from Character Creator just yet. They'd be a cool collection of humans, right? So, the actual boss is probably one of the most boring things in all of Arah. It's heavily time-gated, essentially, and you'll see why. He's invulnerable. He also reflects and blows out if you stand near him, but those other elements aren't really needed. I guess the devs were still getting to grips with what a necessary invulnerability style mechanic would be. To kill Garsem, we need to kill the wraiths that he's perpetually spawning in the room. They once again will appear at these wells, so your team's going to be spreading out and taking them out. The problem this time is wraiths are actually kind of tanky, so if you're trying to kill it on your own, you don't have anyone giving you might, or you don't have anyone supporting you, or just someone else to help you hit it, they can take a fair bit of licking. These specific wraiths have a really fun mechanic called the Grenth's Mark. What they'll do when spawning is pick a player on your team to apply the Grenth's Mark to and keep sapping their life force, essentially. It's represented with these little red bubbles constantly leaking out. It doesn't actually really do much damage, and you can ignore it until, after a full 30 seconds runs out, your time will be up, and it's an instant reap, throwing you into the down state. You can, I believe, evade at the perfect time to mitigate that, or trigger a special invulnerability skill, but the general idea is that you're supposed to kill the wraiths faster than they can kill you with that special Doom mechanic. And yeah, I'm calling it Doom because it reminds me a hell of a lot of the Final Fantasy skill, Doom, and all the happy memories I have associated with that. The boss itself is basically just dying as you kill the wraiths. 5% damage for every single wraith. They're tanky, and there's loads of them you gotta get through, so buckle in for a long sequence. As long as you have the damage to kill a wraith before it can get the mark to finish you off, the mark will go away, and you'll be fine. It's just a matter of beating enough of them up. A bit of a shame, really. I like Grenth a lot, and this fight could have been done a lot better. But hey, at least the open world Temple of Grenth version of the battle is probably the best of them all. A good while later, here I can move on over to the last wraith, and as we kill it for this final 5%, Randall should have something to say.
We've sent Grenth's fallen priest back to the mists. Shards are beginning to react.
He notes there that all the shards we've been collecting are doing something in his pocket, I guess?
The gods left Tyria to the humans centuries ago. If we could only seek out their wisdom.
Again, that suggestion that we can somehow get in contact with the gods. I've really not seen any evidence for that myself, but hey, we can ask what we just fought, and he says a corrupted avatar of the death god, Grenth. Someone must find our gods and tell them of this atrocity. I like how completely outraged and miserable he is at the corruption of these specific things. Obviously, any corruption is terrible, but because these are the high priests and the gods, it somehow feels so much worse. This next room is amazing. In terms of all the extra, unnecessary, hidden rooms that you just skip through and don't really play in dungeons, of which there are an enormous amount, this one is probably my favourite. Look at how beautiful this place is, how underwatery it feels despite the fact that it's risen out of the depths. We have more of these hands knocking us down, and the ceiling is collapsing, the idea being that maybe you get stunned into one thing and hit by the other. I'm taking the time to walk all the way through and show you guys how much detail ArenaNet put in this room. It's quite a large chunk of the map, but the funny thing is, the second you enter this place through the opening doorway, if you just hang a right, you can drop down a tiny little cliff and skip the whole chamber. It's a bit like what we saw at the end of Path 2. Arah P4 is so long and takes you through so many massive chambers that people are so incentivized to just rush through. It's got kind of a weird feel to it, where you don't really know if you've truly seen the whole place a lot of the time. That there's probably entire corridors and huge chunks of the zone that you've never seen, just because the only way you know to do it is to jump down the cliff. Why spend any longer? I gotta get up for work in the next morning. Let's go. Oh, and did I mention the name of that Grenth room? The Slaughter Crypts? Fantastic. Back outside now, and we're on our way to the final High Priest, the Priestess of Dwayna, leader of the gods. The devs definitely knew what they were doing, leaving her for last. And I do mean last. Yeah, that's right. we don't get the 6th god representation here as we travel through the Shattered Cleft. There is no Cormyr, certainly. I mean, she wasn't around to be celebrated by the Orient in the first place, but particularly Abaddon. Abaddon probably could have and should have had a high priest here in Arah. We know he has a cathedral that after the war between the gods was sunk below the sea, but wouldn't there be something left somewhere here in Arah referencing Abaddon even just a little bit? I mean, there's all these artifacts to do with the elder races and the elder dragons, but Abaddon was truly, well and utterly scrubbed clean off the surface of Arah. I think ArenaNet missed a trick. The final boss of this dungeon could have been a Zhaitan corrupted Abaddon related story, which would have paid off even further from what we saw in the Temple of the Forgotten God for the main personal story, but I guess they had a different idea in mind that we'll see shortly. Again, look at all the massive roads here and different places we might be able to travel to. For now, we'll ignore them, but I do have something amazing and hidden to show you all that most players have no idea exists. First, Dwayna to get through. First, we have to spawn the High Priestess. You do that by aggroing these air elementals, these sparks, we already know are associated with Dwayna and Dwayna's power. These are the elementals that spawn around her statues in the open world after all. You grab these sparks and aggro them into this locking mechanism around the statue. Sparks will fall into these blue rings, and once in place, they'll be held there, becoming allies. There are always just enough sparks in the area to fill in all of the little blue rings, and once all are in place, I guess with the air magic charging up the statue, the corrupted priestess
pay for your trespass
will appear. You'll see, just like in the open world, she's this beautiful, winged, almost Largosi looking creature. It's a real treat to fight this thing. She's just so unique. And that's what I meant earlier, that I think it was a good idea to reuse the temple bosses from the open world. Here you'll see I'm permanently stunned. She has a petrification mechanic, a bit like basilisks. I don't know why that's associated with Dwayna here. But basically, a player will be completely eliminated until another player collects one of these Dwayna's tears and throws them on the petrified person. You do that and you can cleanse them. It's really important to learn and utilize this mechanic very aggressively, because quite quickly otherwise your whole team can end up petrified and you'll lose the fight. Every now and then the High Priestess will stealth and go invulnerable. She is actually still around here and you can try to hit her but won't get much damage out. The idea is, during this window of time, she's rapidly regenerating her health, and you need to go back through the motion of locking these sparks in place to get her to appear again. So the game has done quite a good job of, when we first arrive, teaching us the fundamentals of the mechanics, and then making us repeat them under time crunch once the battle is actually ensued. I don't know whether her regeneration has slowed down over the years, or is completely disabled altogether, but I remember being really strict about getting these sparks in as fast as possible, going as far as to dedicating players to specific spawns.
Worship the power of Zhaitan.
Here we burn her for a little bit more damage, and then again, she's going to stealth and disappear. I seem to remember, if you were fast enough, being able to kill Dwayna with just one stealth phase, but that was really rare to see, and again, might have been one of these situations that revolved around keeping chill on her so that the skill she uses to disappear would actually take longer to come back up. All such things eliminated since we moved to the break bar mechanic. With one final spark coming back in, we've done that one quite efficiently.
The power of Zhaitan.
We can blow up the High Priestess of Dwayna for once and for all, leaving just the final boss left.
Dwayna's corrupted servant is at last laid to rest. She would be pleased. Is there no end to such horrors?
Yeah, there is an end, Randall. Don't worry. Well, that was the last one right there. We can say that last creature was an abomination. That was a corrupted avatar of Dwayna, goddess of life and the air. I must find a way to speak with my gods and seek their help. As the path's gone along, Randall's been hinting more and more that he's basically going to try and speak to the gods themselves. Something no human has done for hundreds of years. It's a cool thing to round out the final explorable path with, considering where humanity as a society is generally placed in the world building now. So, I mentioned a really big hidden thing. Did you guys know that there's a whole dynamic event and well-scripted, dialogue-laden sequence most players never play whatsoever? It comes right here before the final boss in Arah P4 with these massive, beautiful fields that most people don't explore much. First, this drake. It has some eggs around it that if you walk near, extra small baby drakes will break out of. You can think of this a bit like that room with the spiders in Twilight Arbor, except the cocoons were broken and bugged. This mechanic isn't bugged, so you can still see just a little bit of that. I'm rather fascinated by it, because nowhere in the open world do you really see that happen. Even though many of the brood mothers and drakes out there do come with egg-looking things nearby, I think you can very rarely find it outside. But here in dungeons it is too. Up on this path, there are some enchanted weapons and armor. I haven't mentioned it yet, but they have appeared every now and then throughout Path 4, and we obviously see them elsewhere in the game. Some of them feature right at the end of the personal story. Why they're only here on the god-related path, I don't know. Is that a subtle clue of some kind? But I will say, if they catch you at the wrong time, they can be some of the more deadly things you'll be fighting. Another extra boss you can kill if you like, this champion Risen Knight. One of the other rooms earlier had a champion hunter, one of the only of his kind. It kind of means that this path starts with an undead champion knight to fight, and also will be ending, almost, with a champion undead knight to fight. You can notice, as we're walking along this higher road, there is a lower road with enemies on it. You can't directly walk into that lower road though, because there's a bone wall there that stops you from doing it. The only way down there is to jump off this cliff. There's also this little bowl of water we're going to come back and look at later, but most players at this point in the dungeon would jump down there. We're not going to do that, and instead take the plunge toward these ooze. There's a lot of mobs to fight here, so we're going to speed a lot of this up. But as they die, in fact, even just as you crowd control them, some of these enemies will drop machine cogs. And if you look at the user interface on the top right, you'll see we're next to an event to repair the cannon and defeat the giants. Cannon gears turned in, 0 of 3. So let's run around, cleaning this whole place up. As ooze, it means a lot of weakness, evading, and splitting into lesser ooze, taking more time. But eventually, you can clear the way. The Pact will actually speak to you. This dude says those blasted giants knocked down our chopper out of the sky. Our cannon has the firepower to take them down, but it's broken. I need 3 cogs to make the necessary repairs. And we can say, I'll see what I do. With the enemies already defeated, this isn't too much of a problem with the first 2 gears, but the last one will be a little bit deeper forward near that Abomination.
I needed that.
I'll point out here that any enemies that try to enter this safe zone with quite a lot of Pact NPCs will get knocked away. So if you're struggling on these fights, you can kind of cheesily pull them to the perimeter and then free DPS them as they all get knocked around. Oh, and get a load of what this A-bomb looks like before he's CC'd, carrying a cog. Does he have skills he can use of that? It's a weird sight you don't see every day. Handing in the last cog presents you with this.
This should do it. Cover me.
The Vigil will move on now, rebuilding this cannon. It's funny, with the amount of Pact technology like these cannons we see at places like Fort Trinity and all the outposts, it's not actually often you ever get to interact with them being rebuilt and fired and used. So this whole animation of this gun being fired is something I really geek out over. What we're doing is a basic defense event right now, where hordes of mobs will come on in and we need to pressure them back. Again, the technique of pulling them right to the blue bubble back there to keep them knock-locked is something I've resorted to in the past when doing this with just limited numbers of players. The event itself, I admit, isn't anything that special in terms of gameplay, but the fact it's so hidden at the end of such a long dungeon path where most players never come, with so many strange, obscure aspects to it, makes this super exciting to me.
Excellent. Prepare to bleed.
Here we see the cannon fire enormous mortar balls, an animation super rare, which is fantastic all on its own. He's aiming at the giants in the background, of a legendary variety for what it's worth. More deadly than the ones we saw in Path 3, and when they land, there's not much of an explosion, that we can see anyway from back here. He does actually kill them. Funnily enough, this last giant though, has survived. I'm pretty sure that's an accident. If you re-watch, you'll notice that the first mortar shot was actually obstructed by this coral positioned in the way, and the giant's life was saved. On the one hand, this is clearly a bit buggy and unintended. On the other, I kind of respect that the integrity of the game's systems have actually worked there. That mortar shot is a real projectile that can be line of sighted and obstructed in the same way anything else can. As a result, the giant's alive when it shouldn't be. Its scripts have broken and it won't fight us back, so we get to just wail on it and take it out. Kind of funny stuff. And with that, the Pact will actually come over to this crashed chopper now, repair it, run on over, and fully evacuate. Again, a ton of detail most people won't see. On the odd chance they finish the event, they'd probably move on by the time you see this full sequence actually play out. And that's the story of the missing Pact squad at the end of P4. Most people leave to suffer and die. For us, we still have the final boss to deal with. That's going to involve getting back up onto that cliff we previously jumped off to see this extra sequence. Well, there's this nice forgiving slope for us to do just that. There is a bit of a branch in the path here. Where you see we're currently walking, killing these spiders, is where I think the developers probably intended for us to move. But before we go too far ahead, let's do a U-turn, walk back up the cliff to where we instead had jumped off, and look at this hole here, this mysterious pipe with the water at the bottom. This is where most players will actually end up jumping down. It takes you to this small underwater section with a few different tunnels you can move around in, and eventually you'll come out, basically meeting back up at where we were a second ago. I even know about 2 or 3 more different cliff-oriented jumping sequences you can utilize here to get to the final boss even quicker, but many of them the devs have attempted to patch over with invisible walls in the interim years, or just given up. Right here at the end of Path 4, I don't think they care too much if players end up missing out on a little bit of content, especially if there's that whole canon thing they're happy to let people skip. And definitely don't let the place name of this region, right at the end of P4, slip you by. It's called the Heaven Crystal Palace. The Heaven Crystal Palace? Well, look, even in a corrupted state, it's pretty gorgeous. I think it's meant to somewhat resemble the Divinity's Reach High Gardens, with these massive, shattered glass spheres hanging from an even larger glass ceiling. It really is a lot like Divinity's Reach, but we can imagine the highly magical Orions and the gods that had led them in those years before, having built much vaster, much more impressive stuff. The Heaven Crystal Palace. Was this where the Orions were somewhat looking at the stars? The gods kind of came from the stars, right? So to what purpose might they have built this construct? Who would live in such a palace? Maybe this is where the Jotun telescope should have been located. You'll also notice how natural the place looks. This is where I thought that maybe the Milan Zoo boss fight would have done well being at. I could understand if Milan Zoo had been the last high priest we took out in this path. Milan Zoo was treated pretty special and preferentially for the main story, being behind her temple that we eventually found the source of ore. But instead, we get something entirely different.
This must be where the Bloodstone was sundered. This is a holy place, overwhelmed by the corruption of the dragons. Clear this, and let me read the Elder Runes.
Apparently, it's where the Bloodstones were separated. I'm not sure what that's got to do with the stars and the blatant Ori above us, but here it is. And, as you can see on that pedestal in the center, it's not just a tiny little fragment, but a big Bloodstone shard. That actually is our boss. As you'd expect, Zaitan's Risen are crowded around it, trying to interact with it as best they can. But the Seer technology has proven too much for them, and they can just watch. We need to clear them out to actually trigger the final fight, where a lot of weird stuff will happen that is not animated or telegraphed well at all, but is pretty significant for the story. I know I said that Path 3 is probably the most major story stuff, in as much as the game will continue, but the subject material here is probably even more important still. It's just more forgivable if the devs don't look at it much. You'll see what I mean in a second.
Each of the Bloodstone shards has been captured by a corrupted servant of a human god, yet this one is not. I wonder why.
It's a good question. This is a pretty goddamn big shard. The Bloodstones themselves are massive titanic platforms, but compared to the tiny fragments throughout the rest of this path, this one's enormous. It's like the size of a human. How haven't they got to it?
Fantastic! The human gods not only sundered the Seers' Bloodstone here, they increased its power. They pulled from the energies of Zaitan himself, even though they did not know of the sleeping Elder Dragon. They only knew that this was a place of great magical power and built their godly city here.
Grayston, what is happening to you?
I hear the stones calling me. I hear the voices of the 6 gods.
So wow, 4 things really fast. First, I'm not sure how Randall comes to the conclusion that the gods didn't know about Zaitan being under here. That's kind of answer to a big question the game's been posing in several areas. And what, we just have to take his word for it? Not to really spoil things here, but later the game will explicitly show the gods did know about the Elder Dragons. So let's just say Randall was jumping to conclusions here and being forgiving about his beloved gods. There is a bit of wiggle room for everything to be true, so you can believe that if you like. The revelation there that the gods put corrupted Elder Dragon magic into the Bloodstones before then sharing that with the races is pretty huge. Maybe that explains why they were so intent on taking it back at a later date, why the lesser races were so ill-equipped to deal with that gift, and it ended up having to be shattered and thrown into the caldera of the volcano on the Fire Island chain. The devs don't really give us enough dialogue to properly dig into it. You may also wonder why the Seers never put corrupted magic into the Bloodstone. I assume that that's bad, but the Seers obviously aren't around to actually answer that question. How does that affect the story going forwards? There's too many questions and too few answers on this one. Then, Randall seems to react with the Bloodstone. What, he's got too many Bloodstones around him now because of the other ones he had before that were reacting when we approached near Dwayna? He says he can hear the gods? Somehow this is letting him communicate with them? Well, on what terms? Then he seems sad, upset, he whimpers, there's an explosion, he becomes a ghost, his head is actually on fire here, and the Bloodstone Shard becomes hostile, triggering the actual fight. So let's talk about the mechanics before the final moments of the dungeon that are just as perplexing as the rest of the things I've just said. It's a solid battle that is, as is so often true, undermined by being too easy to kill. Maybe it's fitting that the final boss fight in all of the dungeons exhibits the same issues so many of the other ones do. It's a shard that doesn't move or dodge or do much, you just have to beat it up, and the idea is that all the other mechanics you face throughout Arah P4 are at play here. Probably the most threatening one is the petrification from Dwayna. Make sure you get people cleared of that, and if you stay generally close to the shard, it has no way of pushing you further out into the poison vortexes that are swirling, and because the fight doesn't take that long, even in its heyday, the Risen Wraiths applying the insta-kill mechanic from Grenth also don't mean much. I do think the devs had a great idea, and I think it's no coincidence how similar this is to the setup they had for Guild Wars 1's Domain of Anguish, where the final encounter was giving you a mix of all the prior stuff. This doesn't hook into the prior stuff of the other paths, just P4, but there have been so many encounters we've gone through up till now, they have a lot of stuff to pick and choose from. With this, we can defeat the shard, and
I go now.
Randall leaves. If you look in the bottom left, you'll see his dialogue was actually cut off there. He was going to say, I go now to seek out the gods themselves, but he despawns so fast, you just get that awkward, I go now. So, that's it. There's no big cutscene. We just left in Arah now with a single sentence to chew on. I guess the idea here is that Randall ascended. That's what I was talking about earlier when I said, wow, this is the sincerest form of flattery you can offer your boss. Sure, they did make Mike O'Brien's head set on fire and seem to toss him about a bit, but the guy has achieved some extra level of enlightenment we don't find any other humans in the franchise attain. There was that comment about Lord Odrin, one of the first explorers of the Mists, earlier in the dungeon, and well, now you see why it's there. Maybe one day, if we get to go to the Mists, we'll be able to speak with Randall and find out what he learned about the humans, about the Bloodstones, and what he was chosen for here. But this is going to become one of those big mysteries. A bit like how in Guild Wars 1, Saul D'Alessio essentially went missing. Here, Randall Greystone has essentially gone missing into the Mists. Again, it's interesting how they tied some seer lore to this without the Seers actually being a very big component, but that is some pretty big lore. Do you see what I mean though? They can actually ignore this one now. They don't have to talk about it in upcoming expansions, while P3, yeah, that kind of did have to be addressed. I know you guys are probably desperate for a lot more conversation about what happened here, and I do have my thoughts, but I'd love to hear what you have to say in the comments too, where we can continue the discussion if need be. There are no right or wrong answers on this one. It's a free-for-all. Let's head over to Lion's Arch for one last time. I'll point out, there is another special item you can get in the game that looks like that Bloodstone Shard as a weapon. Kind of fun, but it's not actually a drop in Arah, or something that you end up spending your currencies on. You have the undead slaying sigils, offerings and gifts of Zhaitan. The gift of Zhaitan was used for the legendary staff at launch, staff being one of the most widely used weapons, so I tend to feel like that's a more prominent one that a lot of players were eventually led to. The weapons are Dragon's Deep weapons. I like that phrase, Dragon's Deep. Is Arah the Dragon's Deep? We actually haven't seen these yet on the series, and I'll be sure to gear some of our characters out with them to make them look like badasses. And the same is true for the armor sets also. We do get the headpiece for beating the personal story, but the rest can now be unlocked here. Undead Slaying's potions, phantasmal tonics, runes of awe are pretty tanky condition damage runes that are worthwhile. The extended potion of undead slaying, and I'll be sure to show you what that tonic actually looks like. We got lucky enough to have a few drops. I guess there are so many chests and so much currency you can get in Arah, you're more likely to have one than you are to miss out this time. So that, guys, is the end of the Dungeon series. You've seen it all now, all the extra lore, and hopefully you understand that Arah is really the main stuff to look at. The rest are just side stories. Maybe the hints about Geheron and COF are something we should cling to for the future. But what I really like about Dungeons now is seeing how closely they reflected what the developers were actually originally going for, as illustrated in that interview on the very first part. I think the developers had the exact perfect ideas, but unfortunately, because of time crunch, it is blatantly clear that they never managed to hit a lot of those lofty goals. You might then think, okay, so now, after the games come out, they can refine dungeons, add new ones that are truly in line with their original ideas, spending more time on them, and see what the player base really thinks. But instead, that's not what ArenaNet went for whatsoever. If you love the idea of those Dungeons & Dragons style dungeoning experience, well, you're kind of out of luck, because the devs moved on from the concept, despite the fact that they never really truly gave it a chance to shine. Sure, there are flashes of it well implemented, and dungeons still serve as a place to get unique rewards and for casual players to run through, but the decision of ArenaNet to move on is something that to this day still remains somewhat contentious among the community. That'll have to be a full discussion we put off for a bit, until we see how their new ideas of endgame ended up. That'll be Fractals of the Mists way down the line, and then eventually raiding even further down the line after that. Stay tuned, you can let me know what you think with your preliminary thoughts, and once again guys, thanks for watching. This has been a very long series, and I know in 2019, people are way less interested about those 2012 days, and I'm really happy to have this catalogue and everything laid out. If you ever wonder anything about a dungeon, or you have friends looking to get into them, please do remember, this series is here, and I mean for it to stay. Thanks guys, hope you enjoyed. And do remember, I'm on Patreon if you want to lend your support to more projects like this. There's a link at the top of the description, and it genuinely does allow me to make more stuff like this. And until next time, take it easy. We're finished now. That's everything that 2012 Corteria really had to offer. After this, we had to wait a bit for new content. That was known as Living Worlds Season 1. That'll be the next playlist to look out for.